He flicked the bill across the table and let it slap against her chest, loud enough to turn heads, then leaned back in his chair and said, "Go ahead, Ava, show everyone how you pay for things you cannot afford." The words did not need to be shouted. They carried anyway, sharp, precise, designed to land, and they did, because the room went quiet in that uncomfortable way where people pretend not to listen while listening to everything. Ava did not move at first, not because she did not hear him, but because she felt every eye in the restaurant settle on her at once, like a weight she could not shake off, and for a second, just 1 second, her breath caught. Jason smiled, slow, confident, already enjoying the moment, as if this had been the plan all along, as if he had been waiting for this exact scene to unfold, and that was when she realized this was not an accident. The waiter approached carefully, professional but tense, placing a polite hand near the edge of the table. "Ma'am, whenever you are ready," he said, and even that sounded louder than it should have, like the entire room had leaned in to hear it. Ava picked up the bill, her fingers steady, but colder than she expected, and glanced down, the number staring back at her, higher than anything she had ever paid for a single meal, and for a brief moment, something inside her dropped. Across the table, Jason poured himself another drink, unbothered, already detached, already acting like this had nothing to do with him, and then he added, almost casually, "Do not take too long. I have somewhere else to be." That line, more than anything, stung, not because of what he said, but because of how easily he said it, like she was already behind him, like she did not matter anymore. Ava reached into her purse, pulled out her card, and handed it over without a word, because speaking right now would mean breaking, and she refused to give him that. The machine beeped once, then again, and the waiter hesitated, just slightly, before saying, "I am sorry, it did not go through." A soft murmur spread through the nearby tables, not loud, but enough to make the moment heavier, enough to make it real, and Ava felt the heat rise in her chest. Not panic, not yet, something else, something tighter. Jason let out a quiet laugh, shaking his head as he stood up, pushing his chair back just enough to draw attention. "I guess some people just like pretending," he said, not looking at her this time, which somehow made it worse. Then he turned toward the exit like the scene was already over, like she was already forgotten. But it was not over. Ava did not follow him, did not call his name, did not react the way everyone expected. Instead, she stayed exactly where she was, still, composed, her hand resting lightly on the table, as if holding herself in place. And that silence, that refusal to break, made something shift in the air. The waiter looked down at the bill again, longer this time, his expression tightening, and then he glanced at Ava, really looked at her, not with judgment, not with pity, but with something closer to confusion. "One moment," he said quietly, stepping away before she could respond, and that was when the manager appeared, moving quickly but carefully, like he had been called for something unusual. Jason was almost at the door now, one hand on the handle, ready to leave, ready to walk out of the story he had just created, and for a second, it seemed like he would. The manager took the bill, scanned it, then looked up at Ava, his eyes narrowing slightly, not in suspicion, but in recognition, and the room, already tense, seemed to hold its breath again. Ava felt it too, that subtle change, that almost invisible shift, like something underneath the surface had just cracked open, and she did not know why, not yet, but she knew this was not finished. The manager stepped closer, lowering his voice just enough to keep it contained. "Miss Carter," he said, carefully, as if confirming something he could not quite believe. "Is that your name?" Ava blinked, caught off guard, the question unexpected, out of place, and for the first time since the bill hit her chest, something else replaced the weight in her chest, something sharper, something uncertain. She nodded slowly. Yes, and that single word seemed to change everything, because the manager straightened, his entire posture shifting, and the way he looked at her was no longer the same, not at all. Behind him, the waiter took a step back, watching closely, while across the room, Jason paused at the door, just for a moment, sensing something had changed, even if he did not know what, and Ava, still sitting there, still calm, felt the entire moment turn, quietly, dangerously, like the beginning of something he never saw coming. The manager did not speak right away, and that silence stretched just long enough to make the entire room feel different, heavier, as if something unseen had just entered the space and taken control. Ava stayed seated, her back straight, her hands still resting on the table. But inside, something was shifting, not panic, not fear, something sharper, something that did not match the humiliation she had just endured. She looked around, slowly, carefully, and for the first time, she noticed the way people were looking at her had changed, not entirely, not yet, but enough to feel it, like the beginning of a ripple that had not reached everyone. A woman at the next table leaned toward her companion and whispered, her eyes flicking back to Ava with curiosity instead of judgment, while a man across the room lowered his phone, no longer recording, no longer certain of what story he was witnessing. That shift should have felt like relief, but it did not, because none of this made sense. The manager held the bill in both hands, reading it again, slower this time, as if confirming something he did not expect to see. Then he looked at Ava once more, and his tone, when he spoke again, was no longer polite in the usual way. It was careful, almost cautious. "Miss Carter, I need to ask you something," he said, and even that simple sentence carried weight. Ava nodded slightly, her eyes narrowing just enough to show she was paying attention now, fully, because whatever this was, it was not about the bill anymore. Behind the manager, the waiter stood still, unusually still, watching the exchange like he was waiting for a signal, and that detail did not escape her. Nothing in this room was random anymore. Jason, still near the door, shifted his stance, his confidence not gone, but interrupted, like a rhythm that had been thrown off by something he could not yet identify. He glanced back over his shoulder, just briefly, and that glance told Ava more than his words ever had, because, for the first time, he did not look in control. The manager took a step closer, lowering his voice even more, but not enough to make it private, not enough to stop others from hearing fragments, and that choice felt deliberate, like this moment was not meant to stay small. "This bill," he said, tapping it lightly with his finger, "was issued under a master account, not a standard table charge." Ava felt a slight tension rise in her chest again, but it was different now, less about shame, more about confusion, because she had not opened any account. Not here, not anywhere like this. "I think there is a mistake," she replied quietly, her voice steady, controlled, but inside, questions were beginning to stack, one after another, too fast to process. The manager shook his head slowly, not dismissing her, but rejecting the idea of an error. "No, ma'am, this system does not make that kind of mistake," he said, and then he paused, just long enough to make the next part matter. "And neither do I." That line landed differently, heavier, and Ava felt it, because now this was not about a failed payment or an embarrassing moment. This was something else entirely. Around her, the room had shifted again, the earlier whispers replaced by a quieter, more focused attention, as if everyone sensed that whatever had just happened was not over, not even close. Ava's mind moved quickly, retracing the last hour, the invitation, the way Jason insisted on this place, the way he ordered without asking, the way he watched her the entire time, waiting, almost like he knew exactly how this would play out. And that thought, that possibility, sent a cold realization through her. This was planned. Not just the humiliation, but everything around it. The bill, the amount, the timing, even the moment he stood up to leave. It all aligned too perfectly, too cleanly. And for the first time, Ava was not thinking about how to get out of this situation. She was thinking about why she had been put into it. The manager straightened slightly, his expression now fully composed, but his eyes still locked on her, searching, confirming. And then he said something that made the tension snap tighter, not louder, but sharper. "Miss Carter, when was the last time you were here?" Ava froze, not physically, but internally, because the answer came to her immediately, and it made no sense at all. "I have never been here," she said. And the moment those words left her lips, the manager's expression changed, just slightly, but enough to confirm that something about that answer did not fit what he was seeing. And across the room, Jason's hand slipped off the door handle, as if he suddenly realized he might not be leaving after all. Ava felt it before she understood it, that subtle shift in the room turning into something sharper, something watching her back, and for the first time since the bill hit her, She made a move. Not careful, not planned, just instinct. She stood up. The chair scraped against the floor, louder than she expected, cutting through the silence, and every eye followed her again. But this time it was different. This time they were waiting to see what she would do next. "This is wrong," she said, not loudly, but clearly enough to carry, her voice steady even if her pulse was not, and she placed the bill back on the table, not gently, not aggressively, just firm, like she was drawing a line she did not fully understand yet. The manager did not react immediately, and that pause, that small delay, made the moment heavier, like he was measuring something beyond her words. Ava took a step forward, closing the distance slightly. "I did not open any account here. I did not authorize anything, and I am not paying for something that is not mine," she continued, each word more controlled than the last, because if she stopped, even for a second, she knew the doubt might come back. Around her, the room shifted again, people leaning in, some nodding quietly, others watching with that same curiosity that had replaced judgment, and for a brief moment, it felt like she had regained something, a piece of control, a piece of dignity. But then the manager spoke, and everything tilted again. "I understand what you are saying," he replied, calm, almost too calm. "But this account has been active for some time, and it is tied to your name, your identification, and your authorization." Ava blinked, the words not landing all at once, because they did not make sense, not together, not in any version of reality she recognized. "That is not possible," she said, sharper. Now, the first crack in her composure showing, and she reached for the bill again, scanning it more carefully, looking for anything that could explain this, anything that could prove this was a mistake. But instead, what she saw made her chest tighten again. Her name, not just printed, but formatted like it belonged there, like it had always been there. Ava Carter. No variation, no error. Exact. Perfect. And underneath it, a line she had not noticed before, small, almost hidden, but clear once seen, primary account holder. The words did not just confuse her, they unsettled her, because this was not random anymore. This was structured, intentional, built into a system she did not know existed. "Who set this up?" she asked, her voice lower now, more focused, and for the first time, she was not reacting, she was questioning. The manager hesitated, not long, but enough to confirm that the answer mattered. "That information is restricted," he said, and that single word, restricted, echoed louder than anything else in the room. Ava felt it then, not fear, but awareness, a growing sense that whatever she had just stepped into was bigger than a dinner bill, bigger than Jason, bigger than anything she had expected tonight. She turned slightly, her eyes scanning the room again, and that was when she noticed them. Two men, seated near the back, not eating, not talking, just watching. They had not reacted like the others, had not whispered, had not moved, and now that she saw them, she could not unsee them. Their attention was not casual, it was fixed, deliberate, and when one of them leaned slightly forward, resting his elbows on the table, Ava felt a chill run through her, not because of what he did, but because of how controlled it was. This was not a normal situation. This was something organized, something monitored. Ava turned back to the manager, her thoughts moving faster now, connecting pieces that did not fit, and without thinking, she made another move, one that felt right in the moment, but dangerous the second after. "Then show me who authorized it," she said, her voice firm again, pushing, demanding, stepping into territory she did not understand. The room went quieter, not louder, and that difference mattered, because this silence was not curiosity, it was tension. The manager's expression changed, not visibly, not dramatically, but enough to show that she had crossed a line she did not see. "Miss Carter," he said slowly, carefully, "I would advise you not to pursue that question here." That was the moment it clicked, not fully, not clearly, but enough. This was not just a mistake. This was something she was not supposed to challenge. Ava felt her grip tighten on the edge of the table, her mind racing, her instincts telling her to stop, to step back, to let this go, but something else, something deeper, pushed against that instinct, refusing to retreat. And then, from the back of the room, one of the men stood up. The moment he stood up, the air changed again, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way Ava felt in her chest before she fully understood it, like the room itself had shifted around him, adjusting, making space without anyone being told to move. She did not know who he was, not yet, but she knew immediately that he did not belong to the same level as everyone else in that restaurant. He walked slowly, not rushed, not hesitant, each step measured, controlled, and the second man remained seated, watching, like this was expected, like this had already been decided. Ava's fingers tightened slightly against the edge of the table, her instincts pulling in two directions at once, one telling her to stand her ground, the other warning her that she had just crossed into something she did not understand. The man stopped a few feet away from her, not too close, not too far, and for a brief second, he said nothing at all, just looked at her, not with curiosity, not with judgment, but with a kind of quiet assessment that made her feel seen in a way that was far more unsettling than being watched by the entire room. "Miss Carter," he said finally, his voice low, calm, controlled, and the way he said her name was different from the manager, not questioning, not confirming, but acknowledging, like he already knew exactly who she was. Ava felt that land harder than she expected, because until now, there had still been a part of her that believed this was some kind of mistake, some kind of misunderstanding that could be explained if she just asked the right question. But this was not confusion. This was recognition. "I think there has been a mistake," she said, forcing the words out again, even though they sounded weaker this time, less certain, because something in his presence made the idea of a mistake feel smaller, less likely. He did not respond right away, and that silence, again, stretched just long enough to make her aware of everything else. The way the manager had stepped slightly back, the way the waiter no longer moved at all, the way the people around them had stopped whispering entirely. It was not just quiet anymore, it was controlled. "There is no mistake," he said, finally, and the simplicity of that sentence carried more weight than anything else that had been said tonight, because it did not argue, it did not explain, it just closed the door on every possibility she had been holding on to. Ava felt something inside her tighten, not breaking, not yet, but shifting under pressure, and she took a small breath, steadying herself, because if she let that sentence define the moment, she would lose whatever ground she had left. "Then explain it," she replied, her voice lower now, more focused, even as her heart began to beat faster, because she knew she was pushing again, and she was no longer sure what pushing would cost her. The man's gaze did not change, did not harden, did not soften. It stayed exactly the same, and somehow that made it worse, because there was no reaction to read, no emotion to hold on to. "This account," he said, gesturing slightly toward the bill, "was not created by chance, and it was not assigned without purpose." Ava felt the words settle into something deeper, something more dangerous, because this was no longer about money, or a dinner, or even Jason. This was about intention. "I did not authorize anything," she said again. But this time it sounded different, not like a statement, but like a line she was trying to hold on to before it disappeared completely. He took a step closer, just one, and the distance between them felt smaller than it should have, not physically, but in a way that made her aware of how little control she actually had in this moment. "Authorization can take many forms," he said, and that line, that vague, controlled answer, made her chest tighten again, because it did not clarify anything. It only made everything more uncertain. Ava's mind moved quickly, searching for something solid, something she could use, something that still belonged to her, and without thinking, she reached for her phone, her fingers wrapping around it like it could anchor her back into something normal, something outside of this room. "I am calling someone," she said, almost instinctively, not even sure who, just needing to break the control that had settled around her. But the moment she lifted the phone, the manager stepped forward, not aggressively, not forcefully, just enough to block the action without touching her, and that small movement said everything it needed to say. Ava froze, her hand still holding the phone, her eyes flicking between the manager and the man in front of her, and for the first time, she felt it fully. The imbalance, the gap, the fact that every move she made was being anticipated, contained, managed before it could even happen. The room was not just watching anymore. It was part of it, part of something structured, something she had stepped into without knowing the rules. She slowly lowered the phone, not because she wanted to, but because she understood, in that moment, that calling someone would not change anything. Not here, not now. The man's expression did not shift, but his voice, when he spoke again, carried a finality that settled over her like a weight she could not shake. You are not in a position to make demands tonight, he said quietly, and that was when Ava realized, with a clarity that cut deeper than the humiliation, that whatever this was, whatever system she had just challenged, it was far bigger than her, and for the first time, she did not know how to fight it. Ava did not move right away, but something inside her did, something small at first, almost invisible, like a crack forming beneath the surface, and then growing, slowly, quietly, until it became impossible to ignore. The weight of his words was still there, pressing down on her, reminding her exactly where she stood, but for the first time, she noticed something else beneath it, something that did not belong to fear, something closer to resistance. She lowered her eyes for a moment, not in submission, but in thought, letting the silence settle around her again, and in that silence, everything replayed, the bill hitting her chest, the laughter, the whispers, the way Jason walked away like she was nothing, like she would always be nothing. And that was the moment it shifted. Not the situation, not the power, but her. Because suddenly, it did not feel like something she had to survive. It felt like something she had to understand. Ava lifted her head slowly, her gaze steady now, no longer searching for approval, no longer reacting to the room, but focusing, narrowing, as if she was seeing everything for the first time. The man in front of her did not change, did not react, but she no longer looked at him the same way, because whatever he represented, whatever system stood behind him, it was no longer just something to fear. It was something that had chosen her. And that thought, that realization, hit harder than the humiliation ever did. Why me? She asked, not loudly, not emotionally, just directly, and the simplicity of that question cut through everything else, because it was the first time she was not responding, she was confronting. The man's expression remained controlled, but there was a pause, a brief one, and Ava saw it, caught it, that fraction of a second where he did not answer immediately, and that was enough. Enough to confirm that this was not random. Enough to tell her she was not imagining it. Around them, the room stayed silent, but it no longer felt like a crowd. It felt like a boundary, something keeping her in place, something she had to push against if she wanted out. You keep saying there is no mistake, she continued, her voice gaining a quiet strength, not loud, not aggressive, but firm in a way it had not been before. But you are not telling me why my name is on something I did not create. The manager shifted slightly, as if preparing to step in again, but the man raised a hand, just a small movement, and that was enough to stop him completely. Ava noticed that too. Every movement here mattered. Every signal meant something. Because it was meant to be, the man said finally, and the answer, instead of clarifying, made everything sharper, more dangerous, because it removed the last piece of normal logic she had been holding on to. Meant to be. Ava felt a quiet frustration rise, not explosive, not uncontrolled, but focused, like something inside. Her had decided it would not accept that answer, not anymore. That is not an explanation, she replied, and this time, there was no hesitation, no uncertainty, just a clear refusal to let the moment close around her. The man's gaze stayed on her, steady, unchanging, but something in the air shifted again, not in her favor, not yet, but not entirely against her either. It was different now, because she was no longer reacting, she was pushing back. Ava glanced briefly at the bill again, then back at him, and for the first time, she did not feel smaller standing there. She felt aware. If this was meant to be, she said slowly, choosing each word carefully, then someone made that decision. Another pause, longer this time, and that pause was everything, because it told her she was getting closer, even if she did not know to what. Ava felt her heart beat harder, but not from fear, from clarity, from the realization that this situation, this system, whatever it was built by people, and if it was built, it could be understood, and if it could be understood, it could be challenged. Not now, not here, but eventually. The weight in her chest shifted again, transforming into something sharper, something that felt like resolve forming under pressure. She was still outmatched, still surrounded, still without answers, but she was no longer willing to stand there and accept it. Not like before. Not again. Ava took a slow breath, steadying herself, grounding herself in that decision. And when she spoke again, her voice carried something new, something the room had not heard from her yet. "Then I am not leaving until I know who made it," she said. And even as the words left her mouth, she knew this was not a safe choice, not a smart one, not in a room like this, not against people like this. But it was the first real decision she had made since the night began, and she did not take it back. Ava did not repeat herself again. She did not raise her voice. She did not try to push harder, because something had already changed inside her. And this time, she chose to stop reacting. She stayed exactly where she was, still, controlled, her eyes no longer searching for answers from them, but observing, carefully, quietly, the way the room responded to her presence. The silence was no longer empty. It was structured, layered, and for the first time, she noticed the pattern. Every time the man spoke, the manager stepped back. Every time she moved, someone adjusted, subtly, almost invisibly, but always in response. Nothing here was random. Nothing here was free. Ava let that realization settle, not rushing it, letting it become clear instead of overwhelming. Because this time, she needed to understand, not just survive. She glanced toward the two men again, then back to the manager, then briefly to the waiter. And something clicked. Not fully, not yet, but enough to see the hierarchy, the invisible lines connecting them, the way authority moved without being announced. The man did not need to command anything directly. The room moved around him anyway. Ava took a slow breath, steady, grounding herself, and then she made her first real decision since everything started to fall apart. She stopped trying to fight the system head-on. Instead, she shifted. She reached for the bill again, but this time, not with frustration, not with confusion, but with intent. She held it differently now, not as something being forced onto her, but as something she was choosing to examine. "If this account exists," she said, her voice calm, measured, no longer pushing, but probing, "then there should be a record of activity." The manager looked at her immediately, faster than before, and that reaction alone told her she had touched something real. Ava did not look at him right away. She let the silence stretch, just slightly, giving him time to think, to hesitate, because hesitation meant weakness, even in a system like this. "Transaction history," she added, as if clarifying for herself. But she was not clarifying, she was guiding the conversation somewhere specific. The man in front of her did not interrupt this time. That was different. That mattered. Ava noticed it instantly. The absence of interruption was a signal. It meant she was no longer being dismissed. It meant she was being evaluated. The manager shifted his weight, a small movement, almost invisible, but Ava saw it, and she held on to it, because this was the first crack she had seen in the control around her. "Those records are internal," the manager replied, but his tone had changed, just slightly, less certain, less absolute. Ava nodded slowly, as if accepting that answer, but she did not step back. She did not retreat. She simply adjusted again. "Then verify the last transaction," she said, her voice steady, neutral, almost cooperative, and that shift, that change in tone, made the request feel different, less like a challenge, more like a process. The manager hesitated again, longer this time. Ava felt it immediately. That hesitation was not random. That hesitation meant something. Around them, the room remained still, but the tension had shifted. It was no longer pressing down on her. It was moving, uncertain, like something had been introduced into the system that it did not fully account for. Ava kept her posture relaxed, her expression calm, even though inside, everything was sharp, focused, calculating. Because this was no longer about proving anything. This was about learning where the limits were. "Just the last one," she added quietly, almost as if she was making it easier for him, reducing the scope, lowering the pressure, and that was deliberate. Because pressure created resistance. Precision created openings. The manager looked toward the man, just briefly, not enough for anyone else to notice, but Ava saw it, and that glance told her everything she needed to know. Approval mattered. Authority flowed in one direction, and for the first time, she understood how to work within it. The man did not respond immediately, but he also did not stop it. That was the moment. That was the opening. The manager nodded once, turning slightly, signaling to the waiter, who moved quickly, retrieving a tablet from behind the counter. Ava watched every movement, every exchange, every glance, absorbing it, mapping it, because now she knew this was not just a system of control, it was a system of patterns, and patterns could be read. The tablet was placed on the table in front of her, the screen glowing softly, and the manager hesitated one last time before turning it slightly toward her. "Last transaction," he said quietly. Ava lowered her gaze to the screen, her heart steady, her mind focused, and for a brief second, everything else disappeared. The noise, the people, the pressure, all of it faded, because this was the first real piece of information she had been given. The first real crack in the system. And then she saw it. The date, the time, the amount, and one more detail. A name, not hers. Ava's eyes narrowed slightly, her breath slowing as the realization settled in, and for the first time since this night began, she felt something shift in her favor, because whoever set this up had left a trace. Ava did not react immediately when she saw the name. She did not look up, did not speak, because the moment she did, she knew everything would shift again, and this time, she wanted to control when that happened. The glow from the screen reflected faintly in her eyes, steady, focused, and for the first time that night, her breathing was even, not forced, not shallow, but controlled. She read the line again, slower this time, making sure she was not imagining it, making sure this was real, and it was. A different name, attached to her account, executing transactions under her identity. Ava felt the weight of that realization settle deep, not as confusion anymore, but as clarity, sharp, undeniable, and far more dangerous than anything she had felt before. She did not need to guess anymore. Someone had placed her here, intentionally, and now she was looking at proof. The manager shifted slightly beside her, waiting, uncertain, no longer leading, and Ava noticed that too. The control had moved, just slightly, but enough to feel it. She lifted her eyes slowly, not toward the manager, not toward the crowd, but toward the man in front of her, because she knew, instinctively, that if anyone in this room understood what she had just seen, it was him. And this time, when their eyes met, something changed. It was not dramatic. It was not obvious, but it was there. A pause, a fraction of a second where his stillness became attention. Ava felt it immediately, the shift in focus, the way his gaze held hers just a moment longer than before, no longer assessing from a distance, but narrowing in, as if recalculating. She did not look away. Not this time. She let the silence stretch between them, controlled, deliberate, because now she understood something she had not understood before. Attention in this room was currency, and she had just earned it. "This is not my transaction," she said finally, her voice calm, steady, not defensive, not emotional, just precise, as she turned the screen slightly toward him, just enough to show what she had seen, but not enough to hand over control. That detail mattered. Everything mattered now. The manager leaned slightly, trying to see, but Ava did not shift the screen further. This was no longer for him. The man's gaze dropped briefly to the tablet, scanning it quickly, efficiently, and Ava watched closely, not the screen, but him, the subtle change in his expression, the almost invisible tightening of his jaw, the way his posture adjusted, just slightly, as if something had confirmed what he already suspected. That reaction told her more than the data itself. He knew, or at least he knew enough. The silence that followed was different again. Not uncertain, not tense, controlled, measured, and for the first time, Ava realized something else, something she had not considered before. He was not just part of the system. He was watching her the way she was now watching it. Carefully, intentionally. The balance had not shifted in her favor, not even close, but it had changed shape. She could feel it. "Then someone used my name," she continued, her tone unchanged, her words placed carefully, not accusing, not demanding, but stating, guiding, testing. The manager opened his mouth slightly, as if to respond, but stopped, glancing again toward the man, waiting, and that hesitation, that dependency, reinforced everything Ava had already started to understand. Authority did not speak unless it was allowed to. The man looked back at her, his expression composed, unreadable, but the attention was there now, undeniable, fixed. "Names are not used lightly here," he said, and the sentence, simple as it was, carried a different kind of weight, because it was not a denial, it was a warning. Ava felt it. Immediately, the implication beneath the words, the suggestion that whatever had happened, it was not accidental, not careless, not something that could be dismissed. She held that moment, letting it settle, letting it sharpen, and then she made another choice. A small one, but intentional. Then someone important made that decision, she said quietly. This time, the pause was longer. Noticeable. The manager looked down. The waiter did not move. And the man in front of her did not respond right away. Ava felt her pulse quicken slightly, but she did not show it. Because this was not about winning. Not yet. This was about understanding how far she could go before the system pushed back. The man's gaze remained. On her, steady, controlled. But now there was something else beneath it. Something new. Not emotion, not interest, but attention sharpened by curiosity, by calculation, by the need to understand why she was not reacting the way she was supposed to. Ava could feel it clearly now. She was no longer just a variable in the situation. She was becoming a question. And questions, in a system like this, were not ignored. They were examined, controlled, or removed. She did not move, did not speak again. She simply held his gaze, letting the silence do the work, letting him decide what she meant, what she knew, what she might do next. And in that moment, she realized something that changed everything. She was still outmatched, still exposed, still inside a system she did not control. But she was no longer invisible. And that was the first thing that made her dangerous, because for the first time, the system was not just watching her, it was trying to understand her. Ava did not look away, even when the silence stretched long enough to make anyone else uncomfortable, because now she understood something deeper than fear, something sharper than confusion. This was not about a mistake. This was about design. She lowered her gaze back to the screen, but this time, she was not just reading the transaction, she was studying it. Every detail, every line, every piece that did not belong, because somewhere inside it, there was a pattern, and patterns meant intention. The name on the transaction was unfamiliar, but the structure around it was not random. The timing aligned too perfectly with tonight. The amount matched exactly what Jason had ordered, not $1 more, not $1 less. And that detail, that precision, made something inside her tighten. This was not just about money. This was about control. Ava felt the shift in her chest again, but this time it was not uncertainty. It was something heavier, something colder, something that settled into place with uncomfortable clarity. She had not been chosen by accident. She had been placed. This happened tonight, she said quietly, more to herself than to anyone else. But the room heard it anyway, because every word she spoke now carried weight. The manager glanced at the man again, waiting, always waiting, and that repetition, that dependency, reinforced what Ava already knew. Nothing here moved. Without permission, Ava lifted her eyes again, slower this time, her gaze no longer searching, but steady, grounded, and when she looked at the man, she did not see just authority anymore. She saw structure, layers, something built long before she ever walked into this room. "You knew," she said, not accusing, not emotional, just stating what had become obvious to her. And that statement landed differently, because it was no longer a reaction, it was an observation. The man did not confirm it, but he did not deny it either, and that silence told her more than any answer could. Ava felt something rise inside her, not loud, not explosive, but deep, steady, undeniable. Anger, but not the kind that made people lose control, the kind that made them focus. Because now it was not just about being humiliated, not just about being left to pay a bill she could not afford. It was about being used, positioned, turned into something she did not agree to be. A pawn. The word came to her quietly, but once it did not leave. Ava looked around the room again, but this time, she did not see strangers. She saw pieces, roles, functions, every person placed exactly where they needed to be to keep the system intact. The waiter, the manager, even the people watching, they were not just witnesses, they were part of it, whether they knew it or not. And that realization, that she had walked into something already set in motion, something designed to play out exactly the way it did, hit harder than anything Jason had done. Because Jason was just a trigger, not the cause. Ava's fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the table, but her expression did not change, because she would not give them that. She would not let them see the full weight of what she had just understood. "So this was never about dinner," she said slowly, her voice steady, controlled, and the room seemed to hold its breath again, because now, she was not reacting, she was naming what was happening. The man's gaze stayed on her, but there was something different in it now, something sharper, more focused, not because of what she said, but because of how she said it. Ava could feel it clearly, the shift in his attention, no longer just observing, now calculating, measuring, deciding. She did not stop, and he was part of it. She added, her eyes flicking briefly toward the door where Jason still stood, no longer leaving, no longer smiling, his confidence replaced with something else, something uncertain, and that was the first time Ava saw him differently too, not as someone in control, but as someone who had played a role he did not fully understand. That thought settled deep. Jason had humiliated her, yes, but he had also been used. Just like her. The realization was quiet, but it changed everything. Ava turned her attention back to the man in front of her, her posture steady, her voice calm, but beneath it, something had hardened, something that would not bend again. "Then tell me what this was for," she said, and this time, there was no hesitation, no uncertainty, just a clear, direct demand for truth. The silence that followed was longer than any before, not empty, not uncertain, but deliberate, like something was being decided beyond her view, beyond this room, beyond anything she could see. Ava felt it, the weight of something larger pressing in, something that made this moment feel smaller than it should, like it was just one piece of something much bigger. And then, the man spoke, but his answer was not what she expected. "You are asking the wrong question," he said quietly. Ava felt that land instantly, sharp, unsettling, because it did not answer anything, it redirected everything. And for the first time since she stepped into this, she realized something even more dangerous than being used. She did not yet know what game she had been placed into, and whatever it was, it had already started long before she arrived. Ava did not answer his statement right away, because this time, she understood something more important than the question itself. She understood timing. If she reacted too quickly, she would fall back into the position they expected, emotional, predictable, easy to contain. But if she waited, if she let the silence stretch just enough, she could shift the rhythm again, even if only slightly. She lowered her gaze to the screen once more, not because she needed to read it again, but because it gave her space, space to think, space to decide her next move without giving anything away. The name on the transaction stayed there, quiet but powerful. And the more she looked at it, the more something began to form in her mind. Not a full answer, not yet, but a direction. This name did not belong to her, but it existed within her account, which meant one thing. The system recognized a connection, whether she understood it or not. And if the system recognized it, then it could not simply erase it. Ava felt a subtle shift inside her, not emotional this time, but strategic, controlled, deliberate, and that shift changed the way she held herself, the way she breathed, even the way she looked at the man in front of her. She was no longer asking what happened. She was asking what could be used. "If this account is active," she said slowly, her voice calm, almost neutral, as if she was thinking out loud rather than challenging anyone, "then it has rules." The manager's eyes flickered for just a second, and Ava caught it instantly. That was all she needed. Confirmation. Every system had rules, and rules could be followed, or bent, or used. "And if it has rules," she continued, lifting her eyes again, steady, focused, "then whoever used my name followed them." The man's gaze remained fixed on her, but there was a shift there now, subtle, controlled, but unmistakable. He was no longer just observing. He was listening. Ava felt it, that slight change in attention, and she leaned into it, just enough, not too much, because too much would draw resistance. "Which means," she added, letting the words settle carefully, "this transaction is valid within your system." The manager straightened slightly, as if preparing to respond, but stopped again, waiting, always waiting, and that hesitation gave Ava exactly what she needed. Space. Ava placed her hand lightly on the edge of the table, grounding herself, and then made her move, small, precise, but intentional. "Then the account is responsible," she said. Not her. The account. The shift in wording was subtle, almost invisible, but it changed everything. She was no longer defending herself. She was redefining the situation. The silence that followed was different again, not heavy, not uncertain, but sharp, like something had just been introduced into the system that did not belong there. Ava felt her pulse steady, not because the pressure was gone, but because for the first time, she was not being pushed back, she was pushing forward, even if only by an inch. The manager glanced at the man again, quicker this time, more noticeable, and Ava saw it, felt it, that ripple moving through the room. She had disrupted something. Not broken it. Not yet. But shifted it. The man's expression did not change, but his eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, not in approval, but in calculation, and Ava understood immediately what that meant. He was reassessing her. That was dangerous, but it was also an opening. Ava did not look away. She held her position, steady, controlled, letting the logic of her statement settle in the space between them. If your system recognizes this transaction, she continued, softer now, almost reasonable, then it cannot ask me to pay for it personally. Another pause. Longer. Heavier. The manager's posture tightened, just slightly, and the waiter shifted his weight, uncertain, as if something had moved outside of the expected flow. Ava felt it clearly now. This was working. Not completely. Not safely. But enough. Enough to create doubt. Enough to force them to consider a different outcome. For the first time since the bill hit her, she was not the one being cornered. The system was adjusting around her. But then, something else happened. Something small. Something easy to miss. The second man, the one who had remained seated until now, leaned forward slightly, his attention sharpening, his gaze moving from the interaction to Ava herself, studying her in a way that was different from the first man, less controlled, more direct, more suspicious. Ava felt it instantly. That shift, that new attention. It was not curiosity. It was recognition, not of who she was, but of what she was becoming in this moment. A variable, a disruption, a risk. And in that second, Ava understood something else, something colder, something far more dangerous than anything she had realized so far. She had gained a small advantage, but she had also made herself visible in a way she could not undo. And now, she was no longer just part of the system. She was a problem the system would need to solve. The shift came fast, faster than Ava expected, and that was how she knew she had crossed a line she was never meant to see. The room did not erupt, no voices were raised, no one stepped forward aggressively, but everything tightened. At once, like a system correcting itself, recalibrating around a threat it had just identified. The manager's posture straightened, no longer hesitant, no longer uncertain, his movements sharper now, more precise, as if the space for negotiation had quietly disappeared. Ava felt it immediately, that invisible door closing around her, and the small advantage she had carved out only seconds ago began to slip, not taken from her directly, but dissolved under pressure she could not control. That is not how responsibility is determined here, the manager said, his tone no longer cautious, no longer reactive, but firm, controlled, aligned with something above him, and Ava knew exactly what that meant. The system had responded. The man in front of her did not move, but his presence felt heavier now, not because he changed, but because everything else had shifted back into place around him, reinforcing the imbalance she had momentarily disrupted. Ava's chest tightened, not from fear alone, but from the realization that every step forward she took was being measured, evaluated, and now corrected. She held her ground, barely, her fingers still resting on the table, but the calm she had built began to fracture under the weight of what was happening. The account does not remove personal accountability. The manager continued, each word deliberate, final, and Ava felt the logic closing in on her again, reshaping the narrative she had just tried to control. The tablet was gently turned away from her, not forcefully, not abruptly, but enough to remind her that access had been temporary, conditional, and now revoked. That small movement hit harder than anything else, because it was quiet, controlled, and completely effective. Ava felt it then, the loss, not of money, not of dignity, but of position. She had been allowed to see something. And now, she was being pushed back out. Her breath slowed, but not by choice, by necessity, as if her body was trying to stabilize against something it could not fight directly. You said it was valid, she said, her voice softer now, not weak, but strained under the pressure, trying to hold on to the logic she had just built, even as it slipped through her fingers. But the man did not respond. And that silence, that refusal to engage on her terms, made everything collapse inward again. Ava's eyes flickered briefly to the second man, the one who had been watching, and now, his attention was no longer passive. It was fixed, sharp, evaluating her like a problem that needed to be contained before it grew. That attention was different. It was colder, and Ava felt it like a warning she could not ignore. The room was no longer uncertain. It was aligned again, and she was outside of it. Ava's thoughts moved quickly, too quickly, trying to find another angle, another opening, but every path she saw now led back to the same realization. She did not control this. Not yet. And the cost of pushing further was rising with every second she stayed standing. "Then tell me what happens next," she said. But even as the words left her mouth, she knew they were not the same as before. They were no longer strategic. They were reaching, searching, trying to regain ground that was already gone. The manager did not hesitate this time. "The balance must be settled," he said, and that sentence, simple as it was, landed with finality, because it erased everything she had just built, everything she had just proven, reducing it back to the same point she started from. Pay, or face the consequences. Ava felt something inside her tighten sharply, not just anger, not just frustration, but something deeper, something heavier, the realization that understanding the system was not the same as being able to change it. Her shoulders remained steady, her expression controlled, but inside, the pressure was building, pushing against the limits of what she could hold together. She glanced once more at the door, at Jason, who now looked smaller than before, uncertain, disconnected from whatever he had started, and that only made it worse, because he was no longer the center of this. He was irrelevant now, and she was still here, alone. Ava's grip on the edge of the table tightened, just slightly, enough to ground herself, enough to keep from losing control completely, but the weight of the moment pressed harder, heavier, closing in from every side. The whispers had stopped. The movement had stopped. Everything had narrowed down to her, her decision, her next move, and for the first time since she stood up, she felt it clearly, the edge she was standing on. One more step, and she might not recover. Her mind raced, searching, reaching, but nothing felt solid anymore, nothing felt safe, and the realization hit her with a quiet, devastating clarity. She was not just losing control of the situation. She was losing control of herself. Ava did not speak again, not because she had nothing to say, but because every word now felt like it would be taken from her, reshaped, used against her in ways she could not control. So she stood there, still, silent, her fingers slowly loosening from the edge of the table, as if even that small grip had become too heavy to hold. The pressure in the room did not fade. It settled, deeper, quieter, more suffocating than before, because now it was no longer a moment of tension, it was a reality she could not step out of. She lowered her eyes, not in surrender, but because looking at them, at the man, at the manager, at the system that had just closed around her, only made it harder to breathe. The sounds around her blurred slightly, not disappearing, but losing shape, like her mind was pulling inward, trying to find something solid to hold on to before everything slipped too far. The humiliation from earlier returned, not as sharp as before, but heavier, layered now with something worse, understanding. She had not just been embarrassed. She had been positioned, used, and now contained. Ava's chest rose slowly, then fell, her breathing measured, controlled, even as something inside her began to fracture under the weight of it all. The logic she had built, the small control she had carved out, it was gone, not shattered, but erased, as if it had never existed in the first place. And that loss hit harder than the bill, harder than the laughter, harder than Jason walking away, because this time, it was not about what they did to her. It was about what she could not do in return. She closed her eyes for a brief second, just one, but in that moment, everything came rushing in, the memory of the bill striking her chest, the quiet whispers, the shift in the room, the moment she thought she understood something, the moment she thought she had an opening. And then, how quickly it disappeared. Ava opened her eyes again, slower this time, and when she did, something in her had changed, not visibly, not dramatically, but deeply, quietly. like something had broken, but not completely. Not enough to end her. Just enough to strip away the illusion that she could fight this the way she had been trying to. She looked at the table again, at the space where the tablet had been, now empty, and that emptiness felt symbolic, like something had been shown to her on purpose, only to be taken away the moment she tried to use it. A test, or a warning. Ava swallowed slowly, her throat tight, her thoughts heavy, because for the first time since this started, she was not trying to push forward, she was trying to understand what it meant to step back. Not retreat, not surrender, just step back. The difference mattered. Her gaze shifted slightly, just enough to take in the room again. But this time, she was not looking for answers. She was looking for patterns, for anything she had missed, anything she had overlooked in her earlier attempts to fight something she did not yet understand. The waiter avoided her eyes now. The manager stood still, composed, but no longer uncertain. The two men remained where they were, one standing, one seated, both watching, both aware, both part of something she could feel, but not yet see. Ava felt the weight of that awareness press down again, but this time, she did not push against it. She let it settle, let it sink in, because resisting it now would only break her faster. The realization came slowly, not as a thought, but as a quiet certainty. She had lost this round. Completely. And there was nothing she could do in this moment to change that. Her shoulders lowered slightly, not in defeat, but in acceptance of that truth, because pretending otherwise would only cost her more. Ava took a slow breath, deeper than before, and as she exhaled, the tension in her chest shifted, not disappearing, but transforming into something else, something steadier, something quieter. She did not look at the man again. Not now. Not yet. Because she understood something important now. This was not a moment to prove anything. This was a moment to learn, to survive, to remember. Ava's hand moved slightly, almost unconsciously, brushing against the edge of the table, grounding herself in something real, something she could still control, even if it was small. And in that small movement, that quiet moment of stillness, something began to form again. Not loud, not clear, but present. A decision. Not spoken, not visible, but real. She would not break here. She would not react the way they expected. She would not give them the version of her they had designed this moment to create. Ava lifted her head just slightly, her eyes steady again, not defiant, not submissive, but something in between, something controlled, something waiting. Because if this was a system, if this was a game already in motion, then she had just learned the first rule. And she would not forget it. Not again. Not ever. And without saying a single word, Ava made the quiet decision that she would not try to win tonight. She would learn how to win later. Ava did not rush to move, and that was the first difference. Before, every second had felt like pressure, like she needed to respond, defend, explain. But now, the urgency was gone, replaced by something quieter, something colder. She let the silence sit, not because she had nothing to say, but because she understood now that speaking too soon meant losing control again. Her eyes lifted slowly, scanning the room with a new kind of focus, not searching for support, not hoping for fairness, but reading it, measuring it, the way it moved, the way it reacted, the way it protected itself. Everything here had a purpose. Every person, every reaction. And she had been the only one who did not know the rules. Not anymore. Ava straightened slightly, a subtle shift in posture, but enough to change how she felt in her own body, more grounded, more deliberate. The weight of humiliation was still there, but it had changed shape, no longer something that crushed her, but something she carried, something she would not forget. She looked at the manager, not as someone in control, but as someone following instructions. She looked at the waiter, not as a bystander, but as a function. And then she looked at the man again, not with defiance, not with fear, but with awareness. He was not just a person. He was a position, a role inside something larger. And that meant something important. It meant he could be understood. Ava took a slow breath, steady, controlled, and this time, when she spoke, her voice was different, not strained, not searching, but even, measured, as if every word had already been tested before it left her lips. "Then we are done for tonight," she said quietly. Not a question, not a request, a conclusion. The manager hesitated for just a fraction of a second, not because he disagreed, but because he was waiting, always waiting, and Ava noticed that again, that pattern, that dependence on something above him. The man did not respond immediately, and Ava did not fill the silence. She let it exist, because she understood now that silence was not empty, it was space, and space could be used. Her fingers moved slightly, brushing against the table one last time before she stepped back, not abruptly, not dramatically, just enough to create distance, physical and emotional. She was not running. She was repositioning. Ava turned her gaze briefly toward the door, where Jason still stood, uncertain, disconnected, no longer the center of anything. And for the first time, she felt nothing toward him. No anger, no hurt, just clarity. He had played his role, and she had played hers. But the game was bigger than both of them. She looked back at the man, holding his gaze for just a moment longer, not challenging, not submitting, but acknowledging, as if to say she understood something now that she had not before. And that moment, that quiet recognition, carried more weight than anything she had said earlier. Because it was not about what she knew. It was about how she would use it. Ava did not ask another question. She did not demand another answer. Because she had already learned the most important thing she needed from this moment. This was not a place where truth was given. It was a place where truth was controlled. And control did not come from asking. It came from positioning. Ava turned slightly, her movement smooth, deliberate, as if she had already decided what came next, even if she had not yet defined it fully. Her steps were slow, measured, each one intentional, not rushed, not hesitant, and with every step, she felt the shift inside her settle deeper, stronger, more permanent. The room did not stop her. No one stepped in her way. But she could feel it, the attention following her, the awareness that she was no longer just another guest leaving a restaurant. She was something else now, something observed, something noted, and that mattered. Ava reached the edge of the room, pausing just briefly, not to look back, but to let the moment complete itself, to let everything she had just experienced settle into something she could carry forward. Because this was not over, not even close. She knew that now. And as she stepped forward again, crossing that invisible line between where she had been and where she was going, something inside her locked into place, not loudly, not dramatically, but with quiet certainty. She would not walk into a room like that again without understanding it first. She would not be placed without knowing why. And she would not be used without choosing what she would take in return. Ava did not look back. She did not hesitate. She simply walked, steady, controlled, carrying something new with her, something that had not been there before. Because the person who walked into that room earlier tonight had been reacting to the world. The person walking out now was already thinking about how to reshape it. And in that quiet shift, in that controlled silence, it became clear she was not the same anymore. Ava did not go far. That was the first move. Not leaving completely, not disappearing into the night the way anyone else would have, but stopping just outside the entrance, just far enough to no longer be inside the system, yet close enough to still feel its presence, its rhythm, its reach. The cool air outside hit her face, sharp, grounding, but her mind did not slow down, it sharpened. Because now, distance gave her something she did not have before. Perspective. She stood still for a moment, watching the reflection of the restaurant's glass doors, not looking directly inside, but seeing everything through angles, through movement, through pattern. The men were still there. The manager had returned to his position. Jason had finally stepped out, but not toward her, not toward freedom, just away from the pressure he never understood. Ava did not look at him. He no longer mattered. Her focus had shifted. Completely. She reached into her bag slowly, pulling out her phone again. But this time, the gesture was not instinctive, not desperate, it was deliberate. She unlocked it, her fingers steady, and paused for a brief second before opening the camera. Not for a picture, for reflection. She angled it slightly, using the screen not to capture, but to observe what was behind her without turning around. A small trick. Simple. Effective. The entrance remained in view. And then she waited. Because now, she understood something crucial. Systems did not just react. They followed through. And if she had become a variable inside that system, someone would confirm it. The seconds passed quietly, but Ava did not move, her breathing steady, her posture relaxed, as if she had already left, as if she was no longer part of what had just happened. And then it came. The door opened again. Not for customers. Not casually. The same man stepped out, the one who had spoken to her, his presence unchanged, controlled, but now directed. Ava did not turn. She did not acknowledge him. She simply let her reflection show him approaching, step by step, closing the distance with measured intent. That alone told her everything she needed to know. He was not finished with her. Good. That meant she still mattered. Ava lowered the phone slightly, as if checking a message, giving him the moment to reach her without resistance. You did not leave. His voice came from behind her, calm, observant, not questioning, just stating. Ava let a small pause settle before responding, her tone neutral, almost indifferent. I needed air. Not a lie, not the truth, just enough. Silence followed. Short, controlled, and then she made her move. Not aggressive, not obvious, just precise. The transaction, she said, still not turning fully toward him. It was processed before I even arrived. That sentence landed quietly, but it carried weight, because it revealed something she was not supposed to know, or at least, not supposed to say. Ava could feel it instantly, the slight shift in his presence behind her, not larger, not closer, but sharper. Attention redirected. Focused. That was the opening. She turned slowly now, just enough to face him, her expression calm, her eyes steady, not confrontational, but aware. Which means, she continued, her voice even, controlled, someone needed me here before I knew I would be. The words were simple, but the implication was not. The man studied her, longer this time, and Ava held that gaze without flinching, because this was no longer about asking. This was about positioning herself as someone who understood more than she should. And that created value. Or risk. Sometimes both. You are drawing conclusions, he said. Finally, his tone unchanged, but Ava noticed the difference. He did not dismiss her. He corrected her. That meant she was close enough to matter. Ava allowed the faintest hint of a nod, as if accepting that, but she did not step back. Then correct me, she said quietly. Another pause. Longer this time. Ava felt it again, that invisible calculation happening behind his stillness, the system adjusting, deciding whether she was still something to manage or something to use. And then, something unexpected happened. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a small card. Plain, minimal, no branding, no detail, just a name and a number. He held it out to her, not forcing it, not offering it warmly, just presenting it as a fact. Ava did not take it immediately. She let the moment stretch, just enough to show that she understood what it meant. This was not help. This was access. Carefully controlled access. Finally, she reached out, taking the card between her fingers, her touch steady, her expression unchanged, but inside, she felt it clearly. This was the first real shift. Not a victory. Not yet. But leverage. And as she looked down at the name printed on the card, something settled into place with quiet certainty. She had not been removed from the system. She had been moved deeper into it. And this time it was on her terms. Ava held the card between her fingers without looking down at it again, because she already understood its weight, not in what it showed, but in what it implied. Access was never given without a reason, and neither was attention. She lifted her eyes slowly, meeting his gaze again, not with curiosity, not with hesitation, but with awareness sharpened into something deliberate. This was no longer an encounter. This was a position. So this is how it works, she said quietly, her voice even, controlled, not challenging, but not accepting either, as if she was testing the edges of something she had just stepped into. The man did not respond immediately, and Ava noticed that pause, not as uncertainty, but as calculation, the same kind she had begun to mirror. That was the first real difference. Before, she had been reacting to his silence. Now, she was reading it. You create the situation, she continued, her tone calm, almost observational, and then you decide who is allowed to understand it. The words were placed carefully, not accusing, not emotional, but precise enough to land where they needed to. Ava watched him closely, not for an obvious reaction, but for the smallest shift, a change in breath, in posture, in timing, because she knew now that control did not show itself loudly. It revealed itself in what was withheld. He tilted his head slightly, just enough to acknowledge her words without confirming them, and that movement alone carried more meaning than a direct answer would have. Ava felt it settle, that subtle confirmation that she was not entirely wrong. You assume a lot, he said finally, his voice steady, measured, but Ava heard the difference, not in the tone, but in the engagement. He was not dismissing her anymore. He was responding. That mattered. Ava allowed a faint pause before answering, letting the silence stretch just enough to keep control of the rhythm, because she understood now that whoever controlled the pace controlled the moment. No, she said softly, her gaze steady, unwavering. I observe. That word hung between them, simple, but sharp, and Ava saw it, that almost imperceptible narrowing of his eyes. Not anger, not approval, but focus. She had shifted from being unpredictable to being intentional, and that changed how she was perceived. Ava glanced briefly at the card in her hand, then back at him, her fingers tightening slightly around its edge, grounding herself in what it represented. Then let me ask the right question, she continued, her voice lower now, more deliberate, as if each word had been weighed before it was spoken. Why give me this? The air between them tightened, not visibly, not dramatically, but Ava felt it, the tension sharpening, narrowing, focusing entirely on that single point. Because this was no longer about what had happened inside. This was about what came next. He did not answer immediately, and Ava did not rush to fill the silence. She held it, steady, controlled, letting it stretch just enough to show that she was not afraid of it anymore. She had learned that silence here was not emptiness. It was leverage. Because you did not react the way you were supposed to, he said finally, and that answer, simple as it was, landed with more weight than anything else he had said so far. Ava felt it settle, not as surprise, but as confirmation. She had been tested, measured, and she had deviated. That deviation had created value, or risk. Ava tilted her head slightly, not in confusion, but in consideration, letting his words sit for a moment before responding. And that makes me useful, she asked, her tone neutral, but her eyes sharp, searching for the layer beneath the answer. Another pause, shorter this time. It makes you visible, he replied. Ava felt that word differently. Visible. Not chosen. Not trusted. Not even wanted. Just seen. And in a system like this, being seen was never neutral. It meant evaluation. It meant potential. It meant danger. Ava's grip on the card loosened slightly, not from uncertainty, but from understanding. She had not been invited into something. She had been identified, and identification came with expectations she did not yet know. And if I refuse, she asked, not as a threat, not as a test, but as a calculation, mapping out the boundaries she was now standing within. The man's gaze held hers, steady, unchanged, and the silence that followed was longer this time, heavier, filled with something Ava could not fully define yet, but could feel pressing against her awareness. You already did not, he said quietly. That answer settled deeper than she expected, because it was not about the future. It was about what had already happened. Ava felt the implication unfold slowly, piece by piece. She had already stepped into this, already engaged, already changed her position within it. There was no clean exit anymore, only movement forward. Ava exhaled slowly, her posture steady, her expression calm, but beneath it, her thoughts moved faster, sharper, connecting pieces she could not yet fully see, but could feel forming into something larger. She looked at him again, holding his gaze, not challenging, not yielding, but meeting it evenly, because now she understood something fundamental. This was not a conversation. It was a negotiation without terms, and neither of them had revealed their full hand yet. The tension did not break. It held, balanced, unresolved. And in that quiet, controlled stillness, Ava realized something that settled into her with quiet certainty. This was not the end of what had started tonight. It was only the beginning. Ava did not move when he finished speaking, but something inside her shifted again, quieter this time, more precise, like a lens adjusting into focus. Visible. That word stayed with her, not as a label, but as a signal. Because being seen meant there was a reason she had been noticed in the first place, and reasons, in a system like this, were never random. She let her gaze drop slightly, not to retreat, but to think, to connect what she had just heard with everything that had already happened, the bill, the timing, the transaction under her name, the way Jason had acted, too confident at first, then too uncertain, like someone who had been given instructions without understanding the full scope of them. That detail, small at the time, now felt different. Ava's fingers tightened slightly around the card again, grounding herself as her thoughts began to move faster, sharper, aligning pieces that had not made sense before. Jason was not supposed to leave that early, she said quietly, not asking, not accusing, just placing the thought into the space between them. The man did not respond immediately, and Ava did not look up right away, because she already felt it, the shift, subtle but real, like she had stepped closer to something she was not meant to see. She lifted her eyes slowly, watching him now with a different kind of focus, not searching for answers, but watching for confirmation in what he did not say. He thought he was in control, she continued, her voice calm, steady, almost analytical now, but he was just following a script. That word lingered, script, and Ava saw it, the smallest pause, the slightest change in timing, and that was enough. Enough to confirm that Jason had not been the architect of what happened. He had been placed, just like her. Ava felt the weight of that realization settle, not as shock, but as clarity, deeper than before, because it changed the structure of everything she had believed about that moment. The humiliation, the bill, the pressure, none of it had been spontaneous. It had been arranged, controlled, designed to unfold in a specific way. So what was I supposed to do? She asked, her tone still even. But now there was something else beneath it, something sharper, more intentional, because this question was not about the past. It was about understanding the expectation she had broken. The man's gaze held hers, steady, unreadable, but Ava could feel the shift again, not resistance, not denial, but attention deepening, as if she had reached a layer he had not expected her to reach this quickly. You were supposed to settle the balance, he said finally. Ava let that sentence settle, turning it over in her mind, examining it from every angle, because it did not just describe an action, it implied a role. Someone who pays, someone who absorbs the outcome, someone who completes the process without questioning it. A pawn. The word returned, clearer now, heavier, but no longer something that defined her. It was something she had stepped out of. Ava exhaled slowly, her posture still composed, but her mind moving rapidly, connecting this new piece to everything else. If she had been expected to pay, to comply, to complete the transaction without resistance, then the entire situation had been structured around a predictable outcome, which meant the system relied on predictability. And she had disrupted it. That was why she was still here. That was why he had followed her outside. Ava's eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in focus, because now she understood something more important than what had happened. She understood what had not happened. The system had not completed its process, and unfinished processes created problems. Then the transaction is still open, she said quietly. The words were simple, but the implication was not. The man did not respond immediately, and Ava saw it again. That brief pause, that fraction of a second where silence became confirmation. She had found something. Not the whole truth. Not even close. But a fracture. Ava felt a subtle shift inside her. Not victory, not yet, but alignment, like she was finally moving in the same direction as the system instead of against it. And that makes me part of something that is not finished, she added, her voice steady, controlled. And now, there was no uncertainty in her tone, only clarity. The man studied her, longer this time, and Ava held his gaze without hesitation, because she was no longer trying to prove anything. She was mapping the structure he existed within. You are beginning to understand, he said quietly. Ava did not react to the words themselves, but to what they implied, because understanding was not something that was given freely here. It was something that came with consequences. Her grip on the card tightened slightly again, and for the first time since she had taken it, she looked at it more closely, not just the name, but the absence of everything else. No title, no company, no explanation, just identity. Stripped down, controlled. Ava's eyes lifted again, slower this time, and when she spoke, her voice carried a different kind of weight, something quieter, but far more certain. This was not about money, she said. The man did not answer, but he did not need to, because Ava already knew. And as that realization settled deeper, something else began to take shape, something she had not considered before, something that shifted the entire direction of her thoughts. If this was not about money, then the person who set this up was not testing her ability to pay. They were testing something else entirely, and she had no idea yet what they were really trying to measure. Ava did not respond right away, not because she needed time, but because she understood now that every agreement in a place like this was never spoken directly. It was shaped in silence, defined in what both sides chose not to say. She looked at him, not as an opponent anymore, not entirely, but not as an ally either, because that word did not belong here. There were no allies, only intersections of interest. She let her gaze linger just long enough to show that she understood the shift that had just taken place. Then she spoke, her voice calm, measured, stripped of anything unnecessary. "If the process is not finished," she said, "then you still need me." The words landed quietly, but they carried weight, because this time, she was not reacting to his system, she was placing herself inside it. The man did not deny it. He did not confirm it either. But the absence of denial was enough. Ava felt it immediately, that subtle adjustment in his stance, not physical, but strategic, like a line had been redrawn between them, not equal, not balanced, but no longer one-sided. "Need is a strong word," he replied, his tone even, controlled, but Ava caught the nuance beneath it. He did not reject the idea. He reframed it. That meant the door was open, just not fully. Ava nodded slightly, acknowledging the correction without stepping back from her position, because this was no longer about being right. It was about staying inside the negotiation. "Then let us call it unfinished business," she said, her voice softer now, but deliberate, placing the words carefully, as if testing how they would settle between them. The silence that followed was different again, not tense, not uncertain, but layered, filled with calculation from both sides. Ava could feel it clearly now. This was no longer a confrontation. It was a setup. She shifted her weight slightly, subtle, controlled, grounding herself in the moment, and then she made her next move, small, but intentional. "You gave me access," she continued, lifting the card slightly, not as a question, but as a reminder, "which means you expect me to use it." The man's gaze dropped briefly to the card, then returned to her, and Ava saw it again, that quiet recognition that she was not misunderstanding the situation. She was stepping into it. "Access does not guarantee outcome," he said. Ava allowed a faint pause before responding, letting his words settle, then adjusting them in her mind, not rejecting them, but reshaping them into something she could use. "No," she said quietly, "but it creates opportunity." That word lingered. Opportunity, not obligation, not submission. Ava felt the shift again, small, but real, like a new layer had been added to the space between them. She was no longer just a participant. She was positioning herself as a variable with potential. And in a system like this, potential was never ignored. Ava's fingers tightened slightly around the card, grounding herself in what it represented, not power, not yet, but access to something that could become power if used correctly. She looked at him steadily, her expression calm, but her thoughts moving fast, calculating, mapping out the edges of what she was stepping into. "Then I will use it," she said simply, not as a promise, not as a challenge, as a decision. The man did not respond immediately, and Ava did not expect him to, because this was the moment where intent was measured, not by words, but by whether she would follow through. "Carefully," he added after a brief pause, his tone unchanged, but the implication beneath it clear. Not a warning, not advice, a condition. Ava held his gaze, not resisting, not agreeing, but acknowledging that condition existed, even if she did not fully accept it, because she understood something now that she had not before. Every condition in this system was flexible, if you knew where to apply pressure. Ava lowered the card slightly, her posture steady, her breathing even, but inside, her mind was already moving ahead, already considering what the next step would look like, not emotionally, not impulsively, but strategically. This was no longer about what had happened to her. This was about what she could turn it into. She took a small step back, not retreating, but creating space, because distance gave her clarity, and clarity was the only thing that mattered now. "Then we understand each other," she said, her voice calm, controlled, but beneath it, something had settled into place, something that had not been there before. Intent, not reaction. The man studied her for a moment longer, his gaze steady, unreadable, and Ava held that moment without breaking, because she knew now that looking away meant giving ground. And she was done doing that. The silence stretched one last time, balanced, unresolved, and then he gave a slight nod, not agreement, not approval, but acknowledgement. That was enough. Ava turned slowly, her movement deliberate, not rushed, and began to walk, not away from the situation, but deeper into something she had just chosen to be part of. The night air felt different now, sharper, heavier, but clearer, like everything had shifted into a new shape she could finally begin to understand. But as she took another step, one thought settled quietly in the back of her mind, not loud, not urgent, but impossible to ignore. In a system built on control, every partnership was temporary, and every advantage came with a cost she had not yet been asked to pay. Ava walked without looking back, but the weight of the moment followed her, not behind her, not chasing her, but inside her, pressing against every step, every thought, every decision she was about to make. The card in her hand felt heavier now, not because of what it was, but because of what it represented, a path forward, yes, but also a line she could not uncross. She slowed slightly, just enough to feel her own movement again, to separate the rhythm of her steps from the rhythm of everything she had just left behind. And in that small space, the conflict surfaced, not loud, not chaotic, but sharp, precise, unavoidable. Because for a moment, just a moment, she had seen something different in him. Not kindness, not trust, but something that could almost be mistaken for understanding. And that was the most dangerous part. Ava exhaled slowly, her breath steady but deeper now, as if she was trying to push something out of her chest before it could settle too deeply. She knew better. She had learned too quickly, too clearly, that nothing in that world was given without purpose. Every word, every pause, every look, it was all calculated. And yet, the way he had said it, the way he had not dismissed her, the way he had followed her outside instead of letting her disappear, those details stayed with her, not as comfort, but as questions. Ava tightened her grip around the card slightly, grounding herself, because she could feel it, that pull, subtle, quiet, but real, the instinct to find meaning in something that might not have any. To believe that there was something more than strategy behind his actions. And that instinct, that small flicker of something human, something hopeful, was exactly what could destroy her if she let it grow. She stopped walking. Just for a second. The city moved around her, distant, blurred, but her focus turned inward, sharp, controlled, as she examined that feeling without letting it take control. Trust. The word came to her, simple, familiar, but completely out of place now. Because trust required stability. And there was none. Not here. Not with him. Not in anything she had just stepped into. Ava closed her eyes briefly, not to escape, but to decide, to cut through the noise of everything she had just experienced and find the one thing that mattered. Survival. Not just physically, strategically, long-term. And survival did not come from trust. It came from control, from distance, from understanding without attachment. Her eyes opened again, slower this time, and when they did, the hesitation that had lingered just beneath the surface was gone, not erased, but contained, locked away where it could not interfere with what came next. She began to walk again, her steps steady, more deliberate now, each one aligned with a decision that had just solidified inside her. She would not trust him, not because he had done something wrong, but because he had done nothing that proved he would not. And in a system like that, uncertainty was not neutral. It was a risk. Ava's mind shifted, recalibrating, not replaying what had happened, but mapping what it meant, the access she had been given, the attention she had drawn, the fact that she was no longer invisible, and the cost that would come with that visibility. She understood now that every interaction moving forward would carry weight, that every word would be measured, that every decision would either strengthen her position or expose her weaknesses. And there would be no second chances. Not here. Not anymore. The memory of the dinner, the humiliation, the moment she had almost lost control, it did not fade, but it changed, transforming from something painful into something useful, something she could carry, not as a burden, but as a reminder of exactly what happened when she let herself react instead of think. Ava slowed again, just slightly, her hand lowering to her side. The card still held firmly between her fingers, and she looked ahead, not at a destination, but at the path she was beginning to understand. This was not a situation she could escape. It was something she had already stepped into, and the only way out was through. She did not need to like it. She did not need to trust anyone inside it. She only needed to learn it, control it, and use it before it used her again. Ava's jaw tightened slightly, not in anger, but in resolve, as the last piece of hesitation settled into silence, replaced by something far more stable, far more dangerous. Clarity. She would not follow instinct anymore. She would not search for connection where there was none. She would not mistake calculated attention for anything personal. From this moment forward, every move would be intentional, every reaction controlled, every step part of something larger than the moment itself. Ava did not look back. She did not question her decision. She simply moved forward, steady, composed, carrying with her not just the memory of what had happened, but the understanding of what it required her to become. And as that realization settled fully into place, one thing became undeniable. She was done choosing emotion. From now on, she would choose control. Ava did not go home. That was the first layer. Instead, she stopped 2 blocks away, just far enough to disappear from immediate view, but close enough to remain within the radius of what she had just stepped into. Distance, she had learned, was not about escape. It was about positioning. She leaned lightly against the cold glass of a closed storefront, her reflection staring back at her, steady, composed, unfamiliar in the best way, and for a moment, she let everything settle into silence. Not empty silence, structured silence, the kind that allowed thoughts to organize, to sharpen, to become something actionable. Her fingers moved slightly, brushing over the card again, and this time, she memorized every detail, the texture, the weight, the absence of anything unnecessary. Minimal, controlled, intentional, just like the system it came from. Ava inhaled slowly, her mind no longer replaying the night, but reconstructing it, breaking it down into pieces she could use. The transaction, the timing, the name that was not hers, Jason's behavior, the man's attention, none of it existed alone. It formed a pattern, and patterns could be redirected. That was the second layer. Ava pushed herself off the glass, her steps measured as she began to move again, not aimlessly, but with a quiet sense of direction that had not existed before. She did not need all the answers. She only needed enough to create pressure points. The name on the transaction, that was one. The unfinished process, that was another. And the fact that she had been made visible, that was the most important one. Visibility meant expectation, and expectation could be manipulated. Ava reached a small corner cafe, still open, dimly lit, just enough to blend into, and stepped inside without hesitation. She chose a seat near the back, not hidden, but not central, a position that allowed her to observe without drawing focus, and placed the card on the table in front of her, not as an object, but as a marker, a starting point. She pulled out her phone again, but this time, she did not check messages, she did not scroll, she opened a blank note, her fingers hovering for just a second before she began to type. Not names, not assumptions, only facts, time, amount, behavior, reaction, every detail she could trust, because assumptions were dangerous, but patterns were reliable. That was the third layer. Ava paused, reading what she had written, not for meaning, but for gaps. What was missing mattered more than what was present. And there it was. The name, the one attached to her account, the one that should not exist. Ava stared at it for a moment longer, then typed it out, slowly, carefully, as if placing it into something larger. Because it was not just a name. It was a connection, and connections were never accidental. She leaned back slightly, her eyes lifting from the screen, her thoughts moving ahead now, not just analyzing, but constructing. If someone had used her identity, then that person either had access or permission, and both possibilities led somewhere important. Ava reached for her phone again, her fingers moving with quiet precision as she searched, not broadly, not randomly, but directly, focused, controlled, narrowing in on the smallest traces of that name. Not expecting answers, just looking for movement. Any signal, any inconsistency. That was the fourth layer. The cafe remained quiet, the low hum of conversation blending into the background, but Ava barely noticed it, her focus tightening, her awareness narrowing into something sharp and deliberate. Because now, she was not reacting to the system. She was building something inside it. A structure, a sequence, a trap. Not one that closed immediately, but one that guided, redirected, forced movement without being seen. Information would be the first trigger, then behavior, then timing. Ava exhaled slowly, her eyes scanning the screen again, and then she saw it. Not an answer. Not yet. But a trace. A reference. A connection that should not have been there. Small, almost hidden, but enough. Enough to confirm that the name existed outside of that transaction. Ava's fingers stilled for just a second, her pulse steady, her thoughts accelerating, because this was it. The first thread. And if she pulled it carefully enough, it would not break. It would lead somewhere. She closed the note, not because she was done, but because she had reached the point where thinking became action. The card remained on the table, untouched, but no longer just an object. It was a key, and she was beginning to understand what it unlocked. Ava stood slowly, her movement controlled, deliberate, as if nothing had changed, but everything had. Because now, she was not waiting for the system to act. She was setting the conditions for it to respond. And somewhere, inside a structure she could not yet fully see, something had already begun to shift. Not loudly, not obviously, but enough. Enough that when the next move happened, it would not feel random. It would feel inevitable. And that was the most dangerous kind of trap. The kind no one realized they had already stepped into until it was too late. Ava felt it before she saw it. That subtle fracture in the rhythm she had just built, like a note slightly off in a sequence that had been too precise to be accidental. She had been moving forward with clarity, each step calculated, each layer aligned. But now, something shifted, not dramatically, not loudly, just enough to disrupt the pattern she had begun to rely on. She slowed as she stepped out of the cafe, her eyes scanning the street, not searching, but sensing, because the environment around her no longer felt neutral. It felt aware. Her phone remained in her hand, the screen dim, the note still open, the name still sitting there like a fixed point in everything she had constructed, but the connection she had just found, the trace that had started to form, it was already beginning to blur. Ava frowned slightly, not in confusion, but in focus, her mind recalculating in real time. That was not supposed to happen. Information did not disappear that quickly, not unless it was being controlled. She turned slightly, her movement casual on the outside, but precise underneath, letting her gaze sweep across the reflection in a nearby window instead of looking directly. No obvious movement. No one approaching. No one watching. And yet, the feeling remained. Ava's fingers tightened around her phone as she reopened the search, retracing her steps, verifying the path she had taken just minutes ago. The reference she had seen, the connection tied to that name, it was still there, but altered. Not erased. Adjusted. Subtly. Enough that it changed the direction she had been about to follow. Ava's breath slowed, not from fear, but from recognition. This was not coincidence. This was response. Her plan had not just been noticed. It had been anticipated. That realization settled into her with quiet precision, and for the first time since she had started building her strategy, she felt the edge of something she could not fully control. She stepped forward again, her pace steady, refusing to let the disruption show, because reaction was the one thing she could not afford right now. But inside, everything was shifting. The layers she had built were still there, but they were no longer isolated. They were being interacted with. Changed. Ava's eyes flicked down to the card in her hand, then back up again, her thoughts moving faster now, connecting what had just happened to the only variable she had not fully accounted for. Him. The access he had given her was not neutral. It was monitored. Of course it was. Ava exhaled slowly, her jaw tightening just slightly, not in frustration, but in adjustment. She had assumed she was building the trap, but she was still inside one. That was the difference, and it changed everything. She stopped walking for a brief second, just long enough to let that realization settle fully, because continuing without adjusting would be a mistake she could not afford to make twice. The system was not static. It adapted. It responded. And now, it was responding to her. Ava reopened her note, her fingers moving quickly, but deliberately, adding a single line beneath everything else. Response latency, immediate. She stared at the words for a moment, letting them anchor her thoughts, because this was no longer about what she knew. It was about how fast the system reacted to what she did. And that meant one thing. She was already being tracked, not physically, not obviously, but through behavior, through access, through every move she made inside the structure she had just stepped into. Ava closed the note again, her grip on the phone tightening, her posture steady, but inside, the clarity she had just gained came with a cost. Her advantage was smaller than she thought. Much smaller. She had been planning several steps ahead, building layers, setting triggers, but now, she understood something she had missed. The system was already operating on multiple layers she could not see, and it was faster. Ava's gaze lifted again, her expression calm, controlled, but beneath it, something sharper had taken hold, not doubt, not fear, but recalibration. Because now, every move she made had to account for something she had not fully understood before. She was not just setting the pace. She was reacting to one she could not control, and that changed the game entirely. Ava took another step forward, slower this time, more deliberate, her mind no longer moving ahead, but circling back, re-examining everything she had assumed was stable. The name, the transaction, the connection, none of it existed in isolation anymore. It was all part of something that could shift without warning, without permission, without her. And as that realization settled deeper, one thought became impossible to ignore, not loud, not dramatic, but precise, undeniable, and far more dangerous than anything she had considered so far. This was not unfolding the way she had planned, not even close, and whatever she had just stepped into was already moving faster than she was. Ava did not stop walking, but she did slow down, not because she was uncertain, but because she understood something new, something sharper than anything she had realized before. Speed was no longer her advantage. Observation was. The system had responded faster than she expected, adjusted faster than she predicted, and that meant one thing. It was not reacting blindly. It was tracking intention. Ava exhaled slowly, her mind no longer racing forward, but folding back, restructuring everything she had just built. The mistake was not that her plan had been seen. The mistake was that she had made it visible too early. She let that thought settle, not as failure, but as correction. Because failure meant loss. This was not loss. This was information. And information, if used correctly, was power. Ava turned slightly, her movement subtle, her gaze shifting not toward the main street, but toward the darker side alley running parallel to it, quieter, less visible, less predictable. She stepped into it without hesitation. That was the first adjustment. Remove visibility. Break pattern. The system had responded to her behavior in open space, so she would no longer operate there. The air felt different here, colder, stiller, and Ava let her senses recalibrate, grounding herself in the shift. Her phone remained in her hand, but she did not open it again immediately. Instead, she waited. Counted. 10 seconds. 20. 30. No movement. No response. The delay itself was data. The system reacted quickly, but not instantly to absence. That meant it relied on engagement. Ava's lips pressed together slightly, not in tension, but in focus, as the realization settled deeper. If interaction triggered response, then lack of interaction created blind spots. That was the second adjustment. Ava opened her phone again, but this time, she did not return to the same search. She did not touch the name directly. Instead, she moved around it, searching adjacent connections, indirect references, anything that would not immediately flag the same response pattern. Her fingers moved slower now, more deliberate, each action placed with intention instead of urgency. This was no longer exploration. This was infiltration. And then, something happened. Not a disappearance. Not an alteration. A delay. A small one. Barely noticeable. But enough. Ava's eyes sharpened as she noticed it, the slight lag in the system's adjustment, the fraction of a second where the information remained stable before shifting. That was new. That had not happened before. Ava felt it immediately, that shift, not in the system, but in her position relative to it. She had found the edge, not of the system itself, but of its response speed. And that edge was where control could be taken. Ava's breathing steadied, her posture relaxing slightly, not from comfort, but from precision, because now she understood something critical. She did not need to outpace the system entirely. She only needed to operate within the gap. She moved again, deeper into the alley, her steps quiet, controlled, her focus narrowing further as she continued to work, not pushing too hard, not triggering full response, but testing, adjusting, learning exactly how far she could go before the system reacted again. One layer at a time. And then, she saw it. Not the full answer. Not yet. But something far more valuable. A partial log. A timestamp sequence tied to the transaction. Not erased. Not altered. Overlooked. Ava's eyes locked onto it, her mind instantly connecting the pattern, the time difference, the gap between when the transaction was initiated and when it was registered under her name. That gap should not exist. But it did. Ava felt a slow, controlled breath move through her chest as the realization formed, precise, undeniable. Someone had inserted the transaction after it began. Not before. Not during. After. That changed everything. Because it meant the system had not created the event. It had been forced to accept it. Ava's fingers stilled on the screen, her pulse steady, her thoughts aligning with a clarity that felt almost dangerous. This was not just control. This was interference. And interference meant vulnerability. Ava lifted her gaze slightly, looking into the darkness ahead, but not seeing the alley anymore, seeing the structure behind everything, the system that had seemed untouchable just moments ago. And now, for the first time, she saw the flaw. Not obvious, not large, but real, and more importantly, usable. Ava lowered her phone slowly, her grip firm, her expression calm, but beneath it, something had shifted completely. She was no longer reacting to the system. She was beginning to understand how to break it. And as that realization settled into place, one truth became clear with absolute certainty. She had just found something the system did not expect anyone to see. And that was power. Ava did not rush the moment, because she understood now that control was not about speed, it was about precision, about choosing exactly when to act, and exactly where to apply pressure. The gap she had found, that subtle inconsistency in the transaction timeline, it was not just a flaw, it was leverage, and leverage only mattered if it was used at the right time. She stepped out of the alley slowly, her posture steady, her expression calm, but beneath it, everything had shifted into alignment, clear, sharp, intentional. This was no longer exploration. This was execution. Her phone remained in her hand, but she was no longer searching. She was constructing. Ava reopened the partial log, isolating the exact moment where the transaction had been inserted, not created, and she traced it carefully, following the sequence not forward, but backward, because origin mattered more than outcome. The system had accepted the transaction, but it had not generated it. That meant the source existed outside the core structure, and anything outside the core could be exposed. Ava's fingers moved with quiet precision, extracting the timestamp, the reference path, the metadata most people would ignore, because most people were not looking for control, they were looking for answers. She was looking for weakness. And then she found it. A secondary authorization node. Small, isolated, overlooked because it was designed to be temporary. Ava felt her breath slow, not from relief, but from clarity, because this was not just a flaw. This was an entry point. And more importantly, it was still active. Ava did not hesitate. She adjusted her position again, stepping into a pocket of shadow near the street, not hiding, but reducing exposure, because what she was about to do required focus, not attention. Her fingers moved quickly now, but not carelessly, each action deliberate, each input controlled, threading through the narrow gap she had identified, not forcing access, but aligning with it, moving in the space. The system had failed to close, and then it responded, not with resistance, not immediately, but with acceptance. Ava felt it instantly, that subtle shift in the interface, the way the data aligned instead of resisting, the way the system processed her input as if it belonged there. That was the moment everything changed. Because for the first time since this began, she was not being processed by the system. The system was processing her input. Ava's eyes sharpened, her focus tightening as she moved deeper, not recklessly, but with controlled intent, accessing just enough, not everything, never everything, because too much would trigger correction. She only needed one thing. Proof. Not for others. For control. And then she saw it. The authorization trail. Fragmented. Hidden. But real. The name connected to the transaction. Not just as a user. As an override. Ava's pulse remained steady, but something inside her locked into place, because this was no longer theory. This was structure. Someone had the ability to inject transactions into the system after they were initiated. Someone above the standard rules. Someone the system did not question. Ava exhaled slowly, her fingers hovering for just a second before she made the final move. She did not erase it. She did not expose it. She mirrored it. Quietly. Precisely. She created a duplicate reference, a shadow of the original authorization, tied not to the system, but to herself. The action was small, almost invisible, but its impact was not. The system paused. Not long. Not enough to trigger a full response. But enough. Enough to register a new variable where there should not be one. Ava felt it ripple through the structure, subtle but real, like a thread being pulled in a tightly woven fabric. And then it stabilized. Accepted. That was it. Ava lowered her phone slowly, her breathing even, her posture unchanged, but the world around her felt different now, not because it had changed, but because her position inside it had. She was no longer outside the system. She was inside its blind spot. And for the first time, she had something it could not immediately correct. Ava stepped back onto the main street, her movement calm, controlled, as if nothing had happened, but the shift was already spreading. Inside the restaurant, the manager glanced down at his tablet, his expression tightening for just a second before he masked it. The waiter hesitated mid-step. The second man in the corner leaned forward slightly, his gaze sharpening. And outside, across the glass, the man who had given her the card turned his head just slightly, not enough to draw attention, but enough to confirm one thing. He felt it too. Ava did not look back. She did not need to, because she already knew what her next move would be. And for the first time since this began, the system was not just watching her. It was adjusting to her. And that was the moment the power began to shift. Ava did not slow down as she crossed back into the light, but she felt it, the shift behind her, not subtle anymore, not hidden beneath layers of control, but present, real, and spreading. The system had registered her, not as a participant, as a disruption. And for the first time, she was not the only one who knew it. She reached the edge of the street and paused, not because she needed to, but because she chose to, because now, stopping was not hesitation, it was control. Her reflection in the glass ahead of her was steady, composed, but her eyes carried something new, something sharper, something that had not been there before. Awareness of position. She was no longer being moved. She was moving the structure itself. The door behind her opened again. She did not turn immediately. She did not react, because reaction was no longer hers to give freely. She waited just long enough to let the moment stretch, to let him step into her space instead of the other way around. And when she finally turned, it was slow, deliberate, controlled. He was closer now, not by accident, not by design she could see, but by necessity. And that alone told her everything. His posture remained composed, his expression still, but something had changed, something small, almost invisible, but impossible to ignore once seen. His attention was no longer observational. It was focused, narrowed, and beneath it, there was tension. Ava met his gaze without hesitation, not searching, not testing, simply holding it, because now she understood something fundamental. The one who holds the gaze, holds the moment. You adjusted the system, he said, and his voice was still calm, still measured, but the difference was there, not in the words, but in the timing. He spoke faster than before, not rushed, but earlier. That meant he was no longer waiting. Ava let a brief silence settle before answering, not because she needed to think, but because she wanted him to feel it, the space where control used to belong to him. It adjusted, she replied quietly. Not a denial, not an admission, a mirror. His eyes narrowed slightly, and this time, Ava saw it clearly. Not calculation alone. Reaction. That was new, and it changed everything. Ava took a single step closer, not aggressive, not challenging, but intentional, closing the distance just enough to shift the dynamic, to force him to recalibrate again. The system accepted something it was not supposed to, she continued, her voice even, controlled, but beneath it, there was a quiet certainty now, something that did not ask for validation. That is not my change. That is yours. The words landed between them with precision, not loud, not sharp, but undeniable. Ava watched him closely, not for what he said, but for what he could not control. And there it was. A pause. A fraction longer than before. a delay that should not exist in someone who controlled everything. Ava felt it immediately, that shift in balance, small, but real, like a scale tipping just enough to be noticed. He exhaled slowly, his jaw tightening for just a moment before it settled again, but Ava had already seen it. That moment could not be taken back. "You are stepping into something you do not fully understand," he said, and this time, the words carried something different, not just warning, not just control, but something closer to urgency, controlled, contained, but present. Ava did not step back. She did not look away, because now she understood something even more important than the system itself. He was part of it, and he was no longer entirely above it. "That is why it works," she said softly. Her voice did not rise. It did not need to, because the power was no longer in volume. It was in certainty. Ava tilted her head slightly, her gaze steady, her posture relaxed, but fully intentional, as if she was no longer standing inside his world, but inviting him into hers. "If I understood everything," she added, "I would be predictable." Silence followed. Longer this time. He did not respond immediately, and Ava knew why. Because for the first time, the unpredictability was not his to manage. It was his to react to. Ava could feel it, the shift rippling outward, not just between them, but through everything connected to him, the system, the people, the structure that had always relied on control, now adjusting to something it could not immediately contain. And then he moved, not stepping forward, not stepping back, just enough to shift his weight, just enough to break the stillness he had held so effortlessly before. Ava saw it, and she knew. That was not strategy. That was reaction. Her grip on the card loosened slightly, not because she needed it anymore, but because she understood what it had already done. It had given her access. But this was different. This was position. Ava held his gaze for one last moment, letting the silence settle into something neither of them could ignore anymore, something that no longer belonged to him alone. And in that silence, something became undeniable. He was no longer controlling the pace. He was trying to keep up with it. His eyes flickered, just for a second, not away, but inward, as if recalculating something he had never needed to question before. And in that brief, unguarded moment, Ava saw it clearly. Not fear, not weakness, but something far more telling. He was no longer certain. Ava did not break eye contact, because now she understood that the moment she looked away, she would lose the one thing she had fought to gain, clarity. And clarity, once earned, could not be surrendered. The silence between them was no longer uncertain. It was loaded, dense with everything that had not been said yet, everything that had been hidden behind layers of control, and Ava felt it pressing forward, ready to surface. She tilted her head slightly, her gaze steady, her voice calm but sharpened by something deeper now, something that had been building since the moment the bill hit the table. "It was never about the dinner," she said quietly. The words did not ask. They landed. Final. He did not interrupt. That alone told her she was right. Ava's chest rose slowly, her breath steady, but beneath it, something was shifting, not breaking, but unlocking, piece by piece, every moment from the night rearranging itself into something clear, something undeniable. "You needed a subject," she continued, her voice still controlled, but now carrying weight, emotion held tightly beneath the surface. Someone unpredictable enough to test the boundaries, but disposable enough if it failed. Her fingers curled slightly at her side, not in anger, but in containment, holding back the surge of realization that was now impossible to ignore. Jason. The transaction. The timing. The humiliation. None of it had been random. "He was bait," she said, her eyes flicking briefly toward the restaurant behind them, where everything had started, just a trigger to push the situation exactly where you wanted it. She looked back at him, and this time, her gaze did not just observe, it cut through, because now she was no longer guessing. She was seeing. "And I was the variable." The words hung in the air, heavier than anything she had said before, because they carried truth, not assumption. Ava felt it fully now, the structure revealing itself, the system not as something abstract, but as something intentional, controlled by people who needed to understand how others reacted under pressure, how they broke, how they adapted, how they could be used. And she had been placed directly in the center of it. Her jaw tightened slightly, the first visible crack in her composure, not from weakness, but from the weight of what it meant. You needed to see if someone outside your system could survive inside it, she said, her voice lower now, steadier, but carrying something raw beneath it, something that had been building since the beginning. And if they could, you needed to know how far they would go. The man did not deny it. He did not confirm it. But his silence was no longer neutral. It was heavy, and Ava felt it land, the final piece locking into place. She exhaled slowly, her shoulders remaining steady, but inside, everything shifted. Because now, the humiliation was no longer just embarrassment. It was design. The pressure was no longer just circumstance. It was manipulation. And the moment she had almost broken, that had been the goal. Ava's eyes sharpened, her gaze no longer searching, no longer questioning, but fixed, certain, grounded in something far more dangerous than anger. Understanding. You wanted to see if I would pay, she said, her voice steady. But now the emotion beneath it was no longer hidden. It was controlled, directed. Not the bill, the cost. The silence that followed was different from anything before. Not tense, not uncertain, but final, like something had been uncovered that could not be put back. Ava felt it rise inside her, not chaos, not loss of control, but something far more powerful, something that had been building quietly beneath every moment of pressure, every shift in power, every realization she had forced herself to accept. Anger, but not the kind that explodes, the kind that focuses, the kind that sharpens everything. Her grip tightened slightly, her breathing steady, her posture unchanged, but her presence shifted unmistakably. She was no longer reacting to what had been done to her. She was deciding what to do with it. You humiliated me to measure me, she said, her voice calm. But now there was no softness left in it, only precision. You placed a transaction under my name to see if I would collapse under something I did not control. And when I did not, she paused, just for a second, not to think, but to let the truth settle fully between them. You made me visible. The words landed with clarity that could not be undone. Ava held his gaze, unflinching, because now she understood something that changed everything. She had not been chosen because she was weak. She had been chosen because she was unknown. And now, she was neither. The tension between them did not break. It transformed. Because this was no longer a test. It was a consequence. Ava took a slow step forward, closing the distance just enough to shift the space again, not aggressively, but intentionally, because now she was no longer stepping into his system. She was standing against it. You built a system that feeds on control, she said quietly, her voice steady, grounded, but beneath it, there was something undeniable, something that had not been there before. But you did not account for someone who learns faster than you can predict. Her eyes did not leave his. Not for a second. That was your mistake. The silence stretched, heavy, unmovable, and Ava felt it settle completely. The past no longer confusing, no longer fragmented, but clear, structured, undeniable. Everything that had happened to her now made sense. And because it made sense, it could not be ignored. It could not be forgiven. And it could not be left unanswered. Ava exhaled slowly, her posture steady, her expression calm, but her decision was no longer forming. It was made. Because this was not just about what they had done to her. It was about what they believed they could do to anyone. And that was something she would not allow to stand. Not anymore. Not after everything she had seen. Not after everything she had become. The balance had shifted. The truth was clear. And the moment for restraint was over. Ava did not step back after her final words, because there was nowhere left to retreat to, and more importantly, nothing left worth preserving behind her. The moment had shifted beyond hesitation, beyond negotiation, into something far more irreversible. She could feel it in the air, in the way the silence no longer felt like space, but like pressure building, compressing everything toward a single point that had not yet broken. She held his gaze for 1 second longer, then turned, not to walk away, but to reposition, because now every movement mattered. Every step was part of something larger that was already in motion. The street around her no longer felt like a neutral environment. It felt like a stage. People passed by, unaware, conversations continued, lights flickered in the distance, but beneath all of it, Ava could sense the shift, the invisible alignment of forces beginning to converge. She moved with quiet precision, her posture relaxed, her expression controlled, but her mind was no longer processing in fragments. It was mapping. Every detail from the night had locked into place. Every piece of the system now visible enough for her to predict its next move. And that was the difference. Before, she had been reacting. Now, she was preparing. She crossed the street slowly, not rushing, not hesitating, her pace deliberate, as if she was already stepping into the next phase before it had fully revealed itself. Her phone remained in her hand, but she did not look at it yet. She did not need more information. She had enough. Enough to act. Enough to force the system to respond on her terms. Ava stopped at the corner, just beneath a flickering streetlight, and for a brief moment, she let her eyes close, not to escape, but to center, to compress everything she had learned into a single line of intent. Because what came next would not allow for adjustment. It would require commitment. She opened her eyes again, and the hesitation that once lived there was gone completely, replaced by something colder, sharper, unmovable. She understood the stakes now. This was no longer about proving a point. This was about dismantling the structure that had assumed it could use her without consequence. Ava's fingers moved again, unlocking her phone, not searching, not exploring, but executing. She opened the mirrored authorization she had created, the shadow embedded within the system, and adjusted it slightly, not enough to trigger immediate correction, but enough to create a delay, a controlled disruption that would ripple outward through the structure. Timing was everything now. She did not need to break the system. She only needed to destabilize it at the exact moment all its pieces were forced to align. Her eyes lifted briefly, scanning the surroundings again, and she noticed it, subtle, almost invisible, but unmistakable once recognized. Movement. Not random. Not casual. Two figures across the street, stationary for too long. A car slowing down just slightly before continuing. The reflection of someone watching from the glass behind her. The system was already adjusting. Already gathering. Ava felt it, not as fear, but as confirmation. They were preparing too. Good. That meant she was right. She stepped forward again, her pace steady, but now there was a new layer beneath it. Something sharper, something that carried intent beyond the moment. She was no longer walking through the environment. She was guiding it. The restaurant behind her was no longer just a location. It was a point of convergence. The man she had faced was no longer just an observer. He was a variable inside the same equation she was now controlling. Ava reached into her bag briefly, not searching, but confirming, her fingers brushing against something small, something she had taken earlier without drawing attention, a detail so minor it had seemed insignificant at the time, but now, it was not. Every piece mattered now. Every detail had a place. She pulled her hand back out, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, but her awareness sharper than ever, because she could feel it, the shift accelerating, the space around her tightening, the system pulling its elements into position without realizing it was being guided. Ava slowed again, just slightly, her gaze lifting toward the building ahead, the one that connected everything, the one that had started it all, and for a brief moment, she allowed herself to see it clearly, not as a structure, as a target. Her breathing remained steady, her steps controlled, but inside, everything had aligned into something undeniable. There was no more uncertainty, no more waiting, no more testing, only execution. She reached the edge of the block and stopped, not because she had to, but because this was the final point before everything shifted from preparation into action. The air felt heavier here, the silence sharper, the tension no longer hidden beneath layers, but present, building, undeniable. Ava did not look back. She did not hesitate. She simply stood there, steady, composed, holding the moment exactly where she wanted it, because now, it was no longer about whether the system would respond. It was about when. And as the seconds stretched, as the movement around her aligned, as the invisible threads tightened into place, one thing became clear with absolute certainty. The countdown had already begun. Ava did not move when he stepped into her space again, because this time, the distance between them was no longer something he controlled. It was something she allowed. The air felt tighter now, not because of proximity, but because every word carried weight, every pause carried intent, and every glance could shift the balance if misread. She held her ground, her posture steady, her breathing even, Her eyes locked on his with a calm that was no longer defensive, but deliberate. "You knew this would happen," she said quietly, not as a question, but as a statement placed with precision, designed to land exactly where it needed to. He did not answer immediately, and Ava watched that pause closely, not for the silence itself, but for what it revealed. Before, his silence had been control. Now, it was calculation. "I knew there would be a response," he replied finally, his tone still measured, but there was something different beneath it, something tighter, something less certain than before. Ava tilted her head slightly, her expression unchanged, but her awareness sharpened. He had adjusted his language. That mattered. "A response," she repeated softly, letting the words settle between them. "Not this one." She took a slow step to the side, not retreating, not advancing, but shifting the angle, forcing him to adjust his position to maintain the same line of sight. It was a small movement, but intentional. He followed, just slightly. That was enough. Ava saw it clearly. He was no longer setting the frame. He was maintaining it. "You expected control," she continued, her voice calm, steady, each word placed like a move on a board that was finally visible to her. Predictable behavior, predictable outcome, predictable correction. She let a brief pause settle, not to give him space, but to take it. "You did not expect interference." His jaw tightened, just for a second, barely visible, but Ava caught it. That was all she needed. Confirmation did not come from words anymore. It came from fractures. "You are assuming intent where there may be none," he said, his voice steady, but the rhythm was different now, slightly faster, slightly more direct. Ava almost smiled, not from amusement, but from recognition. He was pushing back. That meant he felt pressure. "There is always intent," she replied, her tone unchanged, but her eyes sharper now, more focused, especially in a system that does not allow accidents. Silence followed, heavier this time, more concentrated, as if the space between them had narrowed to a single point of tension neither of them could step away from without losing ground. Ava did not blink. She did not shift. She held it, because now she understood that endurance was part of control. "Then tell me," he said, his voice lower now, less measured, more direct. "What do you think you have found?" Ava let the question sit for a moment, not because she needed time, but because answering too quickly would give him rhythm again. She would not give him that. Not anymore. "Not what?" she said softly, her gaze unwavering. "Where?" The distinction was small, but it changed everything. He did not respond immediately, and this time, the silence stretched longer than before. Ava felt it settle, the shift becoming clearer, sharper, undeniable. He was no longer ahead of her. He was catching up. "You are inside a gap," he said finally, his tone controlled, but now there was something else beneath it, something closer to tension than authority. Ava inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the statement without confirming it, because she understood now that information was no longer something to share. It was something to hold. "And gaps close," he added. Ava took a slow breath, her posture still relaxed, her presence steady, but her eyes did not soften. "Only if you see them in time," she replied. The words landed clean, precise, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The world around them continued, distant, irrelevant, because everything that mattered had narrowed down to this exchange, this moment, this shifting line between control and loss of it. Ava could feel it now, not just in him, but in the system behind him, the subtle adjustments, the quiet recalibrations, the way attention had shifted from observation to containment. They were reacting, not fully, not openly, but enough to confirm that what she had done mattered. "You are playing a dangerous game," he said, and this time, the words were not just measured, they were weighted, carrying something closer to warning than before. Ava did not step back. She did not break eye contact, because now she understood something he did not fully accept yet. This was no longer his game alone. "No," she said quietly, her voice calm, grounded, unshaken. "I am changing it." The silence that followed did not resolve. It deepened, because neither of them had finished. Neither of them had revealed everything. And both of them knew this was only the beginning. Ava did not raise her voice, did not step closer, did not make a dramatic move, because she understood now that the most decisive actions were the ones that appeared almost invisible until it was too late to undo them. She simply looked at him, steady, unblinking, her silence no longer passive, but controlled, deliberate, holding the moment in place as if she alone decided when it would move again. Then she spoke, softly, almost quietly, but with a precision that cut deeper than anything louder ever could. "You already lost control," she said. The words did not echo. They settled. Heavy. Final. He did not respond immediately, and Ava saw it. Not just the pause, but the fracture beneath it, the way his focus shifted inward for just a fraction of a second, as if recalculating something that no longer aligned. That hesitation, that was new. Ava took a slow breath, her posture still relaxed, but her presence sharper now, undeniable, because she was no longer navigating his system, she was forcing it to respond to her. "You built something that depends on predictability," she continued, her tone even, controlled, but layered with something deeper now, something that no longer asked for permission to exist. "And the moment I stopped being predictable, you started reacting." His jaw tightened again, more noticeable this time, not enough to break composure completely, but enough to reveal strain beneath control. Ava did not miss it. She leaned slightly to the side, not to close distance, but to shift perspective, forcing him to adjust again, forcing him to follow her movement instead of leading it. He did. Subtle, but undeniable. That was the break. Ava felt it clearly, that shift in balance moving past the point of recovery, because now it was no longer about who understood the system better. It was about who controlled the moment. And she did. "You called it a test," she said, her voice lowering slightly, each word placed with intention. "But you never planned for the subject to rewrite the rules while you were still observing." The silence that followed pressed harder than anything before, thick, unmoving, because this was no longer a conversation. It was exposure. Ava lifted her hand slowly, not abruptly, not dramatically, and held up her phone, not pointing it at him, not threatening, just showing it, letting the implication settle without needing explanation. "I do not need to break your system," she said quietly, her eyes locked on his, unwavering. "I only need to prove it can be broken." That was it. The moment, everything shifted. He did not step back, but he did not step forward either. And for the first time since she had met him, his stillness did not feel like control. It felt like restraint. Ava watched him closely, her breathing steady, her pulse calm, because she could feel it now, not just in him, but in everything connected to him, the tension tightening, the unseen structure adjusting, the awareness spreading outward like a ripple that could not be contained. She lowered her hand slowly, her expression unchanged, but her eyes sharper than ever, because now she understood something he could no longer deny. She was not a variable anymore. She was a factor. "You made me visible," she said, her voice soft, but carrying a weight that could not be ignored. "And now you cannot make me disappear without proving everything I just said." The words did not challenge him. They cornered him. Ava saw it clearly, the shift in his gaze, not away from her, but deeper, more focused, more intense, as if he was searching for something that no longer existed. Control, certainty, both were gone, replaced by something else, something unfamiliar, something reactive. She took one final step forward, closing the space between them just enough to make the moment unavoidable, her presence steady, grounded, unshaken, and for the first time, she did not feel like she was standing inside his world. He was standing inside hers. "So now," she said quietly, her voice calm, controlled, but absolute, "you do not get to decide what happens next." The silence that followed was different from anything before. It was not a pause. It was an impact. The air felt heavier, thicker, as if the entire space had shifted under the weight of what had just been said. No one moved. No one spoke. The system, the man, the moment itself, all of it held in place, suspended between what it had been and what it had just become. And in that stillness, in that heavy, unbroken silence, one truth settled into place with undeniable clarity. Everything had changed, and neither of them had yet decided what that meant. Ava did not need to say anything else, because the system was already speaking for her. It started subtly, almost invisible, the kind of shift that only someone paying close attention would notice. Inside the restaurant, the manager looked down at his tablet again, but this time, he did not recover as quickly. His fingers hovered over the screen a fraction too long, his posture tightening, his confidence no longer automatic but forced. Ava saw it through the reflection in the glass, not directly, but clearly enough. The system was no longer seamless. It was hesitating. And hesitation, in a structure built on control, was the first crack. She did not move, did not intervene, because she did not need to. The sequence had already begun. One disruption, then another. The waiter, who had once moved with quiet efficiency, paused mid-step, glancing toward the manager, waiting for direction that did not come immediately. That small delay rippled outward, barely noticeable to anyone else, but Ava felt it like a signal. The chain was breaking. Not all at once. Not dramatically, but piece by piece. The second man inside leaned forward again, but this time, it was not curiosity. It was concern. His gaze shifted between the tablet, the manager, and then briefly toward the glass, toward Ava, as if trying to understand what had changed, what had triggered this subtle but undeniable loss of rhythm. Ava held her position, her expression calm, her breathing steady, because now she understood something fundamental. She did not need to push anymore. The system was responding to itself. "You feel it," she said quietly, not looking away from the man in front of her, her voice calm, but carrying quiet certainty. He did not answer, but he did not need to. Ava saw it in the way his focus fractured, not fully, not enough to lose control completely, but enough to reveal strain, enough to show that the system behind him was no longer aligning perfectly with his expectations. That was the second crack. "They are waiting for correction," she continued, her tone even, almost observational now, as if she was no longer part of the confrontation, but analyzing it from above. "But there is no immediate correction, is there?" The words landed with precision, because they did not accuse. They exposed. Inside, the manager finally tapped the screen, but his movement was not smooth, not confident, and the delay had already spread. The waiter shifted again, uncertain. The second man's posture tightened further. Small reactions, but connected. A system that once moved as one was now moving in fragments. Ava felt it fully now, the domino effect she had set into motion, not through force, not through destruction, but through misalignment. She had not broken the system. She had forced it to question itself. And that was far more dangerous. "Control depends on certainty," she said softly, her eyes never leaving his. "And certainty is gone." He inhaled slowly, his composure still intact on the surface, but Ava could see the difference now, the effort behind it, the adjustment happening in real time, the recalibration that should have been instant but was now delayed. He was not losing control completely. Not yet. But he was no longer ahead. And in a system like this, that was everything. Ava took a slow step to the side again, shifting the angle, watching as his attention followed, not immediately, but just enough to confirm what she already knew. He was reacting, not leading. "You built something that corrects weakness instantly," she continued, her voice calm, steady, but now there was something undeniable beneath it, something that carried quiet authority, but you did not build it to handle uncertainty. Another pause, another ripple. Inside, the manager looked up now, not at the tablet, but toward the man outside, toward him, seeking direction that did not come immediately. That hesitation spread again, outward, into every small movement, every delayed reaction, every uncertain glance. Ava did not need to look to know it was happening. She could feel it. The system was no longer stable. It was adapting too slowly. And that delay was enough. "They are looking at you," she said quietly, her voice lowering slightly, not to soften, but to sharpen, to focus the moment into something unavoidable. "And for the first time, you do not have an immediate answer." The words did not attack. They revealed, and that made them impossible to ignore. He did not respond. Not right away. And that silence, that unfilled space where certainty should have been, spread further than anything she had said so far. Because now, it was not just her who noticed. They did too. Ava held his gaze, steady, unshaken, because now she understood something deeper than control. She understood collapse. Not loud, not sudden, but inevitable once it began. And it had begun. The manager straightened slightly, trying to recover, trying to restore order, but the rhythm was gone. The waiter hesitated again. The second man shifted, his attention no longer passive, but alert, questioning. The system was no longer invisible. It was visible. And once something became visible, it could not return to what it was before. Ava exhaled slowly, her posture relaxed, her presence grounded, because she knew now that she did not need to prove anything else. The system was proving it for her. One crack, then another, until everything that once felt unbreakable began to fracture under its own weight. She did not smile. She did not react. She simply stood there, watching, understanding, because now, the outcome was no longer a question of if, only when. And as the tension continued to spread, as the system continued to struggle to stabilize, one truth settled quietly into place, clear, undeniable, and closer than ever before. There was only one move left to make. Ava did not move, not because she was frozen, but because she had reached the exact point where movement itself became power. The air around her felt suspended, like everything had aligned into a single fragile moment that could collapse in any direction depending on what she chose next. She stood at the center of it, steady, grounded, no longer reacting, no longer adjusting, but holding the entire structure in place simply by understanding it. That was the difference. That was the transformation. She could feel the system around her, not as something external anymore, but as something she had stepped inside, something she now understood from within. The hesitation in the manager's movements, the uncertainty in the second man's posture, the shift in his gaze, all of it connected, all of it dependent on a control that no longer existed in the way it once did. Ava exhaled slowly, her breath even, her posture relaxed, but beneath it, her awareness sharpened to its highest point. There was no fear left, not because the situation was safe, but because she had already crossed the line where fear mattered. Everything that could have broken her had already been used. Everything that could have controlled her had already failed. What remained was choice. She looked at him again, not as someone above her, not as someone she needed to read or anticipate, but as someone standing inside the same moment she now controlled. And for the first time, she did not see authority. She saw limitation. That realization settled into her quietly, but completely, like the final piece of something that had been building since the very beginning. She was no longer inside his system. He was inside her decision. Ava let her gaze soften slightly, not in weakness, but in certainty, because now she understood something deeper than control itself. Control was not about forcing outcomes. It was about deciding which outcomes were allowed to exist. The system behind him was unstable. The connections were visible. The flaw she had found was real. And more importantly, it was enough. Enough to expose. Enough to destabilize. Enough to change everything. She did not need to go further than that. That was the realization that mattered most. Ava's fingers brushed lightly against the phone in her hand, not activating it. Not yet, just acknowledging what it represented. The proof. The leverage. The irreversible step waiting just beneath the surface of this moment. She could feel it, the weight of that choice, not heavy in the way it once would have been, but precise, like a line drawn in front of her that could not be stepped back across once crossed. She glanced briefly toward the restaurant, not to look inside, but to feel the shift that had already begun there, the imbalance, the uncertainty, the quiet collapse that had started to ripple outward. It would continue, whether she acted or not. But if she acted, it would accelerate. It would finalize. It would expose everything. Ava's eyes returned to him, steady, unwavering, and in that moment, there was no tension left between them. Not because it had resolved, but because it had reached its final form. There was nothing left to negotiate, nothing left to test. Only the outcome remained. He did not speak, and this time, his silence did not feel like control. It felt like waiting, waiting for her. Ava felt that clearly, that shift, that acknowledgement, unspoken but undeniable. The system, the man, the moment, all of it had converged into a single point of decision. And that decision was hers. She took a slow step forward, not to close distance, not to challenge, but to mark the moment, to define it, to claim it as something that would not be undone. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was quiet, calm, but absolute. "You said I became visible," she said. A brief pause. Then, softer, sharper. "Now you will see what that means." She lifted her phone slightly, not dramatically, not as a threat, but as a confirmation, a signal that what came next would not be undone, would not be contained, would not be corrected. The air tightened, the silence deepened, and for a fraction of a second, everything held still, balanced on the edge of something irreversible. Ava did not hesitate. Not anymore. Because this was no longer about what they had done to her. It was about what she would allow to exist after it. Her thumb hovered for just a moment over the screen, the final layer of control resting in the smallest movement she had left to make. And then she decided. Ava did not rush the movement of her thumb, because this was not an act of impulse. It was the culmination of everything she had chosen to understand, everything she had refused to become. She pressed the screen once, deliberate, controlled, and the action did not feel explosive. It felt precise, like placing a final piece into a structure that had already been built. The system responded immediately, but not with resistance, not with correction, instead with exposure. The mirrored authorization she had created did not break the system. It illuminated it, tracing the hidden override back through its origin, forcing it into visibility without collapsing it entirely. Ava watched the screen for a brief moment, not to confirm success, but to measure the reaction, and what she saw was exactly what she intended. The data did not disappear. It expanded. Connections that had once been silent began to surface, not publicly, not chaotically, but internally, where the system could not ignore them. Inside the restaurant, the manager's posture shifted sharply, his composure slipping just enough to be seen, his eyes scanning the tablet with a focus that no longer carried certainty, but urgency. The second man stood now, not abruptly, but with intention, his attention no longer divided, but fixed entirely on what was unfolding beyond his control. Ava did not look directly, but she felt it, the chain reaction moving outward, not destroying, but destabilizing, forcing every layer to confront something it had been designed to conceal. She lowered her phone slowly, her breathing even, her posture unchanged, because she was not here to escalate beyond what was necessary. This was not revenge. This was correction. You built a system that hides its own interference, she said quietly, her voice steady, grounded. So I removed the cover, not the structure. He did not respond immediately, and Ava could see why. Because what she had done did not give him something to fight against. It gave him something he had to face. The truth, once visible, did not require force. It required acknowledgement. Ava met his gaze again, not with hostility, not with satisfaction, but with clarity, because this moment was not about defeating him. It was about redefining what he represented. You tested me to see if I would break, she continued, her tone calm, but layered with meaning. But the system you built was already compromised. The silence that followed was not empty. It was heavy with recognition. Ava saw it in the way his focus shifted, not outward, but inward, as if recalculating not just her actions, but the entire foundation he had been standing on. That was the point. Not destruction, realignment. Ava took a slow step back, not retreating, but creating distance, because she understood now that control did not mean staying inside the conflict. It meant knowing when to step out of it. The tension remained, but it no longer belonged to her. It belonged to the system she had exposed. Inside, the manager spoke quietly into a device, his voice low, controlled, but no longer steady. The second man moved toward the back, his steps measured, but urgent beneath the surface. The chain reaction was no longer subtle. It was active. Ava watched it unfold without interfering, because she had already made her choice. She would not tear everything down. She would let it stand long enough to confront what it had become. You still have control, she said softly, her eyes returning to him one final time. But now it comes with accountability. The words did not challenge. They defined, and that definition could not be undone. He inhaled slowly, his composure still present, but no longer absolute, no longer untouched by what had just happened. Ava saw it clearly, not in a single moment, but in the accumulation of small shifts, the tension in his jaw, the delay in his response, the weight behind his silence. He was no longer operating above the system. He was inside its consequences. Ava turned slightly, her movement calm, deliberate, because she understood now that the outcome did not require her presence anymore. It would continue. It would unfold. And it would demand answers that could no longer be avoided. She began to walk, not quickly, not hesitantly, but with a steady pace that reflected something deeper than confidence. Finality. Behind her, the system continued to react, voices lowering, movements tightening, attention shifting in ways that could not be reversed. The structure still stood, but it was no longer invisible. And that changed everything. Ava did not look back. She did not need to, because she already knew what would follow. Exposure leads to pressure. Pressure leads to fracture. And fracture always comes with a cost, not just for the system, but for everyone inside it, including her. Ava did not stop walking until the noise behind her softened into something distant, something that no longer demanded her attention. The tension that had once wrapped around every movement, every breath, every thought, had begun to loosen, not suddenly, not completely, but enough to be felt. The street ahead of her looked the same as it had before, lights steady, people passing, voices blending into the quiet rhythm of the city, but for the first time, she was not measuring it, not calculating it, not trying to understand where she stood within it. She already knew. Her steps slowed naturally, not out of hesitation, but because there was no longer a need to move with urgency. The moment that had required everything from her had passed, and what remained was something quieter, something deeper, something that settled into place instead of pushing forward. Ava exhaled slowly, her shoulders lowering just slightly. The first visible release of tension since the night had begun. It was not relief. It was recognition. Recognition that the weight she had been carrying was no longer the same. It had not disappeared. It had changed. She paused near the corner, her gaze lifting briefly to the buildings around her, not searching, not scanning, just observing, as if seeing the world again without the constant need to interpret it as a threat or a puzzle. The system she had stepped into, the structure that had once seemed untouchable, was still there, still functioning, still intact. But it was no longer hidden. And that difference mattered more than anything she could have done to destroy it. Ava's fingers loosened around her phone, her grip no longer tight, no longer defensive. The device felt lighter now, not because its importance had diminished, but because its purpose had been fulfilled. It was no longer a tool she needed to hold on to in order to protect herself. It had become something else. A reminder. She turned slightly, her eyes drifting back toward the direction she had come from, not to re-enter the moment, but to acknowledge it, to understand what had been left behind. The man was still there. She could feel it, even without looking directly, not watching her in the same way, not controlling the space, but existing within the consequences of what had been set into motion. The difference between them now was not distance. It was position. Ava did not feel the need to confront him again, not because the conflict had disappeared, but because it had changed form. What needed to be said had already been said. What needed to be revealed had already surfaced. The rest would not be decided through confrontation. It would unfold through consequence. She turned back forward, her posture steady, her expression calm, and began walking again, this time with a rhythm that no longer carried tension, only direction. The city felt quieter now, not because it had changed, but because she had. The sharp edges of awareness that had once kept her alert, reactive, ready for impact, had softened into something more controlled, more intentional. She was still aware, but she was no longer on edge. That distinction mattered. Ava passed a storefront window and caught her reflection briefly. She stopped, just for a moment, not out of vanity, but out of curiosity, as if she needed to confirm what she already felt internally. The woman staring back at her looked the same. Same features, same presence, but there was something different in her eyes. Not hardness, not anger, something steadier, something grounded. She held that gaze for a second longer, then allowed a small, almost imperceptible shift in her expression, not quite a smile, not quite relief, but something close to acceptance. She had not won in the way she might have imagined at the beginning. There was no clear victory, no clean resolution, no moment where everything simply reset into something easier. But she had changed the rules. And more importantly, she had changed herself within them. That was enough. As she continued walking, the sounds of the city settled around her again, no longer distant, no longer irrelevant, but part of something she could move through without resistance. Behind her, the system would continue to respond, to adjust, to attempt to stabilize what had been exposed. People would react. Decisions would be made. Consequences would unfold. But those were no longer hers to carry. She had done what she came to do. Ava slowed once more as she reached the end of the block, her pace easing into something natural, unforced, as if the urgency that had once driven her forward had finally been released. The air felt different here, lighter, calmer, not because the world had changed, but because the storm inside her had settled. She took one final breath, deep and steady, and let it out slowly, allowing the last traces of tension to fade into something quiet, something stable. And for the first time since it all began, there was no pressure, no urgency, no need to act. Only stillness. Only clarity. Only the quiet understanding that what had been set in motion would continue, but she no longer needed to chase it. The storm had passed, and what remained was calm. Ava did not stop at the edge of the city block, but she slowed just enough to feel the world settle into its natural rhythm again, not as something she had to navigate carefully, but as something she now moved through with quiet certainty. The night no longer pressed against her. It opened. The weight that had once defined every step she took had transformed, not into absence, but into something steadier, something she could carry without it controlling her. She understood now that nothing had been simple, not the humiliation, not the manipulation, not the system that had tried to reduce her into something measurable, predictable, disposable. But she also understood something far more important. None of it had defined her. She had walked into that dinner as someone who believed fairness existed by default, that respect was something granted through position or circumstance, that systems, no matter how complex, were built to function with some level of integrity. And she had been proven wrong. Completely. That was the injustice. Not just what they did, but what they assumed she would accept. That she would absorb the humiliation, carry the burden of something she did not create, and quietly return to the place they believed she belonged. But she had not. And that was where everything changed. Ava paused briefly as she reached a quiet intersection, the streetlights casting a soft glow across the pavement, her shadow stretching forward in front of her, no longer something she felt chased by, but something she followed. Her reflection appeared again in a darkened window across the street, and this time, she did not stop out of curiosity. She stopped out of recognition. The woman looking back at her was not untouched by what had happened. She was shaped by it. Every moment of pressure, every shift in power, every decision she had made when she could have broken, all of it was there, not visible on the surface, but embedded in the way she held herself, in the stillness of her gaze, in the absence of fear where it once lived. She had not become harder. She had become clearer, and clarity was power. Ava let that realization settle fully, not as a victory, not as a conclusion, but as a foundation. Because what she had done was not about revenge. It was not about tearing something down just to prove she could. It was about refusing to let something broken remain hidden simply because it had always been that way. She had exposed it. She had forced it into the light. And in doing so, she had changed the terms of the world around her, even if only slightly, even if only for those who were paying attention. The man behind her, the system he represented, the people inside it, they would adapt. They would rebuild. They would try to restore what had been disrupted. But they would never return to what they were before. Because now, there was awareness. And awareness, once introduced, could not be removed. Ava turned her gaze forward again, her steps continuing, steady, unhurried, grounded in something that no longer needed to prove itself. She did not need recognition. She did not need validation. The shift had already happened. Not just in the system. In her. That was the part that mattered. The part that would carry forward long after the night faded into memory. She had learned that power was not given. It was understood. It was taken, not through force, but through clarity, through the refusal to accept what did not align with truth. She had learned that injustice was not always loud, not always obvious, but it was always present where control existed without accountability. And she had learned something else, something quieter, but far more enduring. That the moment you stop asking for fairness is the moment you begin creating it. Ava reached the end of the street, the city opening wider in front of her, possibilities no longer abstract, but real, tangible, shaped by the decisions she would make moving forward. She did not look back. She did not need to. Because the person who had once stood there, uncertain, exposed, searching for answers, no longer existed. In her place stood someone who understood the cost of truth, the weight of choice, and the power of refusing to be defined by someone else's system. And as she disappeared into the quiet rhythm of the night, leaving behind a structure that would never quite stabilize the same way again, one final truth remained, clear, simple, impossible to ignore. They did not break me. They revealed what I would never let them control.